A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
For months I'd been keeping a secret that had woven itself into the very fabric of my life, a heavy thread of anxiety braiding through each day until it was suffocating, and it all stemmed from declaring the monumental news, "I'm pregnant, I don't know who the father is." Just uttering those words was like casting a spell over my existence, invoking the eyes of curiosity and judgment that felt like 1,000 needles prickling my skin. It was brave of me to finally admit it to my closest friends, gathered at my place for a low-key Saturday night. With a nervous laugh, I hoped for a supportive reaction. "Who could have gotten you pregnant?" Jen asked first, her eyes widening with concern, and a wave of awkward laughter washed over the room because while it wasn't intended to be a joke, what unfolded felt surreal and absurd. There was a tumult of hurt and confusion, questions swirling in the air like insects seeking warmth, and suddenly, it was no longer just about the baby. It felt like I was in the middle of a courtroom trial where the jury was made up of my closest friends. I watched their faces morph from surprise to judgment as I shared the chaotic tale of wild nights out, of fleeting connections and blurry memories, the desperation for escape that led me from the mundane into the arms of 4 different men over the course of 3 chaotic months, thinking only momentarily of the consequences. Then Mark, who had always had a knack for cracking the wrong joke at the worst time, blurted out, "So, wait. What's the worst-case scenario? You give birth to a soccer team, and now you're a single mom?" I faked a laugh, but what spiraled in my chest felt like a volcanic eruption of dread, igniting like sparks in dry kindling. I could feel it, my life was about to go under a lens, mournfully dissecting every dangerous decision that led up to this point. The seconds passed like hours, and then, oh, God, of course it had to be him. Steve, the least tactful of the bunch, chimed in next. "You know, if you give us a DNA test, it could potentially save on child support?" The room fell silent, air sucked out like a deflated balloon, and the bitter chill that followed wrapped itself around my spine. I wanted to scream, to shake them out of their crude humor, but instead, a surge of shame washed over me, heavier than I had imagined. I realized in that moment that the gravity of my situation hadn't registered to them. They were simply racing to find humor in my pain, clinging to the absurdity rather than grappling with the reality of my dilemma. I wanted to run, to hide from their laughter, but I was frozen in place, a statue caught in the act of despair. "It's not a joke," I finally managed to whisper, and the weight of my words shocked the group into silence once again. But it was too late, too much had already been said, the air thick with my embarrassment. Jen, sensing the awkwardness, tried to step in and salvage the moment. "Come on, guys, she needs us." But even her voice felt tentative, like she was tiptoeing on the ashes of a burned-out fire. Instead of support, the realization dawned on me like a cold shower: these people didn't understand. They couldn't empathize because they weren't the ones tangled in this web of uncertainty, parenting looming like a thundercloud over my head. I reached for my drink, attempting to drown the humiliation with a gulp, only to be confronted by Steve once more who, despite his earlier blunders, now looked surprisingly serious as he leaned in. "But seriously, have you thought about what you'll do?" That question spiraled into an avalanche of thoughts crashing down, chaotic glimpses of a future laced with unknowns, and my heart raced. I had pushed that concern away, preferring jokes and laughter to facing the truth that loomed so large. I could almost feel the walls of my entire life threatening to close in as if they could sense my terror. What if it's even worse than I imagined? What if I realize I'm utterly unqualified to raise a child? The chilling possibility gripped my throat. They didn't understand that the scarier part was the identity of the baby's father looming in the dark corners of my mind, shadows creeping forward, representing endless possibilities of who could show up knocking on my door one day. The one man who'd caught my fancy now represented nightmares, undesired connections, uncertainty, all staring me down like demons ready to crack open the front door of my life, revealing secrets I'd chosen to bury under the guise of fun and youth. The laughter and joking continued behind me, but I grew increasingly detached, their voices fading into the distance as I slid into a panic, weighed down by the burden of losing control. As if reading my thoughts, Jen reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly, but I barely registered. In a realm of anxiety, every little gesture felt like it was happening in slow motion, and I could feel the crushing reality bubble underneath my skin, bringing with it the very real fear that perhaps one of those men was not just a fleeting quirk of my youth but was embedded so deeply into my future that I wouldn't be able to escape it. Hours later, after my friends finally left and the quiet enveloped me, I sank onto the living room floor, cradling my words, my mind swirling with the complexities of a situation that no joke could ever capture. Stripped of the bravado I had worn like armor throughout the night, I found myself grappling with the true weight of my news, realizing it went far beyond my own shame. It would affect lives, including that of a child I could be bringing into this world. And then, with the stillness of the night seeping into my soul, a dreadfully familiar thought echoed louder than the rest. Was the father among those men who'd once held me, or was someone else lingering in shadows, an unseen co-creator waiting patiently for his time to emerge? That night, I sat alone, not laughing or joking, just clinging to this bizarre amalgamation of reality and fear, knowing deep down I had only just begun to scrape the surface of a horror far more tangible than anything I could have ever made up, a ticking clock reminding me that life, wild and unpredictable as it once seemed, was about to throw everything I thought I knew into disarray. When I saw the thread titled "What Causes Death More Than People Realize?" It was late at night, the kind of late where the world outside felt like a distant memory, and the shadows of my home seemed to whisper secrets of their own. I began to scroll through the replies, half incredulous at the tales of freak accidents and mundane illnesses, when one post caught my eye. A user shared a chilling account about shadows that seemed to cling to the dying, almost as if they had a will of their own. Skeptical, yet intrigued, I dug deeper into the stories surrounding this phenomenon, discovering a series of accounts from survivors who claimed to have encountered these shadows in the final moments of loved ones. They described them as black, formless figures that hovered just at the periphery of the dying person's sight. Most chilling was how they would often nod toward whatever hauntingly beautiful lore had caught the dying person's attention, as if beckoning them toward a new realm, a shadowy abyss where light dared not tread. The more I read, the more I felt an odd compulsion to dig into my family history, curious about how death had etched its way through our lineage. My grandmother's illness had always been shrouded in mystery. She suffered for years, and every time her breaths grew labored, those shadows seemed to grow nearer. After she passed, my father became strangely withdrawn, refusing to discuss her or offer comforting memories, a move that solidified my belief that something terrifying had swept through that room the night she left us. So, I decided to confront my father, coaxing him into telling me what really happened during her final hours, but each probing question only deepened the crease in his forehead, a stony resolve reminding me that some ghosts are better left buried beneath layers of silence. One stormy evening, seized by a mix of desperation and curiosity, I rifled through my grandmother's old belongings, uncovering a dusty, ornate box hidden beneath her bed. Inside were letters, half-burned photographs, and a collection of strange trinkets that made my skin crawl. Among them was a tiny glass vial containing what looked like a dried, withered flower, its petals curled and dark, a talisman, perhaps, a remnant of some long-abandoned superstition. Feeling a strange pull, I took the vial with me, convinced that it might hold the key to understanding those markers of death that lurked in my family's history. That night, I awoke from a vivid dream where I stood in a shadowy forest, surrounded by those same lurking shapes, feeling their cold tendrils brush against my skin while I desperately searched for my grandmother's voice. I woke in a sweat, the visions clinging to me as I realized the shadows were now within my grasp. Afraid of what this meant, I tossed the vial aside, but regret quickly tugged at my conscience. Something primal told me that I was dealing with forces far beyond my comprehension. As days turned into sleepless nights and shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, I became convinced I was being watched. Friends began dropping off, their shockingly brief health troubles making headlines around town, and when I whispered their names in my tired confessions, I could almost feel the presence of the thing I had inadvertently set free. The whisperings took on a new urgency. I had come to believe that this was a reciprocation, that in my search for answers, I had courted something sinister and now, it was gathering strength. Convinced that they were drawing closer, I visited the local library, engrossed in research about folklore and the myths surrounding the shadows. Eyewitness accounts detailed how the shadows not only claimed the dying but those left behind, creating a chain of despair that left entire families broken and ruined. I became aware of the concept of something called the death's echo, a phenomenon whispering its way through generations, like a spider spinning its web of tragedy from one heart to another. Each consequence felt amplified, sudden, swift illnesses claimed more than just the physical, an insidious link seemed to infect the minds of the grieving. In a haze of panic, fueled by endless nights of no sleep, I scoured the housing market for a new home, a way to escape this invisible predator. But each time I tried to pack up my belongings, I caught a glimpse of the shadows waiting patiently, almost mockingly, as if daring me to flee. So, I stopped. Instead, I set about uncovering my familial ties back through my great-grandparents, hunting records and logs that told tales of sudden deaths and unexplainable illnesses, stringing together an eerie pattern of madness that tugged at the roots of my sanity. One stormy night, half mad with dread, I sat surrounded by flickering candles in the accumulated weight of my history, a maelstrom of whispered names and weeping letters, and as my gaze drifted toward the vial, I recognized a lethal truth. I could hear them faintly, the figures pulsating, drawing near, the air thickening with their intent and knowing, craving, always craving. It was then that logic twisted into revelation. This family curse, this lingering darkness, thrived on our fears, feeding on the vulnerable and lost. Realization swept over me like cold water. Everyone I had lost had had their final moments entwined with a soft, seductive call from the shadows. I felt raw panic coursing through my veins, and that was when I committed the final act of desperation. In a whispering prayer to reversible fate, I unscrewed the vial, letting the dried flower's contents scatter around me like ghostly petals. It was the dawn that greeted me when I first dreamed of her, a fleeting visit from the woman whose essence had been torn from me, the shadows dissolving into the illumination of her embrace. I could feel her warmth, her love brewing within me as I begged her to stay, and just as I thought she might, the comforting glow dimmed, and with it, my understanding, that to love is to lose, but in acknowledging this cyclical darkness, we bind the shadows with our own memory. I sat there tracing my every thought, daring the creeping figures to show who they were, but all I had was her voice, tender and knowing, echoing behind the veil like a lullaby lost to the night. It was in that charged silence of understanding where I grasped a bitter truth. The shadows wait patiently, hidden within the corner of our frail humanity, drawn not by the death we fear but by the love that compels us beyond the edges, a reminder that life is but a veil, delicately spun between light and darkness, and the more we cling to what we love, the closer the looming shadows creep. It was only then, as the dawn broke around me, with the shadows still murmuring outside, that I realized, death doesn't always claim, sometimes, it simply whispers. All right. Brace yourselves because what I'm about to confess might send a chill down your spine, especially if you've ever indulged in fast food chicken nuggets. Let me take you back a few years to when I worked the late-night shift at our local fast food joint. I wasn't just another teenager killing time and hunting for booze money, I had a purpose. I did something that most of you might consider a blessing, perhaps even a hit of pure luck, a gift from the nugget gods. But behind those cheeky extra McNuggets, there was something darker. It started innocently. I was a bored high schooler, feeling invisible under those greasy fluorescent lights, just another pawn in the grind of minimum wage. I started adding an extra McNugget to random orders because, hell, why not? It wasn't coming out of my check, and the delight it brought to unsuspecting customers was a drug in itself. But what began as petty rebellion morphed into something I never anticipated. One particularly slow night, close to the graveyard shift, I noticed a pattern: strangers who came in looking normal, like weary travelers, ordinary parents with screaming kids, or that loner teen with hooded eyes. Once they got those extraordinary meals, they'd return, not always the next night or the next week, but eventually, with a glow in their eyes that I recognized. We exchanged wordless smiles, a silent understanding, as if they knew that someone had handpicked them, made their lives incrementally, digestively happier. With time, these customers became familiar, their lives somehow intertwined with mine. What I didn't realize was that they weren't just coming back for the tantalizing chance of an extra nugget, they returned because they were becoming addicted to something far darker than fast food. Beneath the surface, those McNuggets carried a shadowy secret I was oblivious to. Our food shipment had changed suppliers without warning, and nothing was quite as it seemed. Not until one night, when a shadow cloaked the counter, a face so unsettlingly familiar it made my stomach curl. He leaned in, reeking of something sour and mossy, like forgotten graves. Without saying much, except for a casual "Hey kid, nice night for extras, huh?" I realized he saw through the gimmick, straight to the darkness nesting beneath fryers and sizzling grease traps. His eyes were like shards of coal, almost void of life, yet pulsating with something sinister. The grin he shot me felt omnipotent, as if crowning him the ringmaster of my puppet show. For weeks after that encounter, my nights warped into something not of time but of tension. Customers continued to come, but I noticed how they appeared different, not just happy, but eerily euphoric, their faces flushed yet skin taut over bones, eyes bulging like they've gazed into the abyss and returned with a taste that can never be satisfied without my intervention. Their increased frequency and fervor began to terrify me. They came during odd hours, restlessly peering through glass panes long after closing. One by one, they dripped in, some begging, some threatening, until it was clear that the extra McNugget trick had hooked them. However, it was the aftermath that sparked my dread. A string of reports on the news about missing persons overlapped disturbingly with my list of frequenters. The most unsettling part? Each report mentioned an unnatural obsession with fast food chicken nuggets just before their disappearance. Eventually, those reports dwindled, leaving a dark void in public discourse, and I could almost hear that sinister melody playing somewhere in the shadows, a hymn only I seemed to tune into. It was as if my little act of unauthorized generosity had connected these souls to me, and something far beyond me. I tried quitting multiple times, but the hold it had on me, and them, was inexplicable. Like a web, sticky and resilient, every other job attempt collapsed the moment a person walked in holding a crumpled nugget box, eyes locked onto mine like they'd wandered through galaxies just to find the creator of their boundless longing. Sometimes I'd wake at night drenched in sweat, a ghostly whisper haunting my dreams, "Feed us." I'd see flashes of all those faces, including the ones that stopped returning, like flickering shades in a nightmare carnival, forever hungry, forever searching. As time and courage betrayed me, stacking the odds against breaking free, I became aware that the greasy little packets weighed more than just processed chicken. They bore cravings, desires, and stories of lives slipping away. The last shift I worked, that strange man returned, strikingly unchanged as if time bypassed him. He leaned across the counter, those eyes promising a twilight of peace, or the complete absence thereof. "You were chosen," he murmured, "to feed souls beyond your world." Then he slid a nugget towards me, a maddening echo of those I'd once given out like candies. Only now, the gesture felt final, a haunting cape swirled around my fading sanity. That encounter sealed it for me. I've stayed on the move since, working nights at random gas stations, diners, anywhere those familiar faces can't find me. But even there, the allure trails like an insidious shadow. No matter how far I run, echoes of crackling fryers, oily vats, and greedy munching haunt my reality. Sometimes, just sometimes, I'll catch someone casting a veiled look my way in another rundown diner at 3 a.m., always with that same insatiable hunger in their eyes. And I know they were looking for something I inadvertently promised them years ago. But now, it's a curse I can't escape. So next time you find an extra nugget in your box, enjoy it cautiously. After all, you never really know who's behind the fryer or what dark secret they've unwillingly passed to you. When I decided to charge my adult children rent, I told myself it was just a necessary part of life, a way to instill responsibility and teach them the value of hard work. After all, I wasn't made of money, and the bills kept piling up like dirty laundry in the basement. But as the words came out of my mouth, I noticed the subtle change in their expressions, the disbelief merging with something darker, a silent accusation emerging from their eyes. It started innocently enough, a casual dinner where I bragged about my new job that paid enough to finally tackle my overdue debts while my twins, Melissa and Jake, lounged carelessly at the table, their lives unfurling like some tapestry of opportunity in a comfortable home. Yet I was feeling stretched too thin, my savings account was dwindling, and I knew the house was running on fumes. So, with the confidence of a man who felt trapped by obligation, I proposed charging them a modest rent. Their laughter died instantly, leaving a grim silence that became heavier with each tick of the clock on the wall, and they exchanged glances, talking silently, their brows knitting together as if they were conspiring against me, plotting their escape from the monster that their father had seemingly transformed into. I thought surely they'd understand. After all, they'd been living under my roof, enjoying the comforts that came with it, a pool, a game room, and a pantry stocked with everything a young adult could ever want. All I was asking was a small contribution to help keep the lights on. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself trapped within a chilling, shadowy atmosphere. The house that had once been filled with laughter now echoed with whispers, my children's voices reduced to hushed tones when they thought I wasn't listening, talking about me like I was some sort of villain in their story. One night, I overheard them in the living room, plotting what to do about their tyrant father, their words slicing through me like frostbite, and with every venomous remark, I felt a growing pang of regret for not having asked them to contribute sooner, for not realizing that I had become the villain in my own narrative. A comment from Melissa about how I had lost it and how all my sacrifices had been in vain clenched a fist around my heart, squeezing until I could barely breathe. It was as if the very walls of my home, once a refuge filled with warmth, had begun to conspire against me, the frayed edges of my sanity fraying further each day until one evening, I stood at the kitchen counter, a dull ache pulsing at the center of my chest, when a chill skittered down my spine, and I caught a glimpse of their faces in the reflection of the microwave, pale, hollow, eyes darting furtively as if a dark thought loomed over them, and then it hit me, they weren't just angry at me, they were frightened, caught in a web where I was the spider, looming larger than life, an almost monstrous figure in the familiar confines of our home. As the days turned to weeks, I tried to reach out, tried to mend what I thought was a misunderstanding, but every time I approached them, they retreated instead, their once open cherubic cheeks now hollow, filled with the bitterness of my decision and the chilling reality that they had grown up in a house that was no longer a home, just a place of sharp corners and dirty secrets. In desperate attempts to reconnect, I'd leave little notes of encouragement around the house, but they fell unanswered on the kitchen table like pieces of an unfamiliar puzzle, accumulating in a pile of unacknowledged love, until one night, completely exasperated, Jake called me out, putting me in my place as he accused me of being selfish for expecting them to pay for what they hardly asked for, conveying that my choice had ripped apart the fabric of the family we had once woven together with love and laughter. I remember wanting to scream back, to tell them that life wasn't just about free room and board but molded by grit and responsibility, the lessons I thought I was teaching buried beneath the crushing weight of their disappointment in me, but instead, I stood there silently, feeling the heavy cloak of regret slide across my shoulders, swallowing the bitter words that were threatening to fall from my lips. Every evening after that turned into a round of relentless silence. What had once been filled with familial jokes and food fights transformed into quarrels over dish duty and time spent together with black and glaring eyes, the dining table becoming a battleground where laughter once thrived, now too echoey with heartache and strife to decorate with plates. Then, on a rainy Tuesday, weeks after I had first delivered the ultimatum, everything shifted, the thermostat refused to warm the house, and a strange urgency compelled me to fix it fast, but after poking and prodding the ancient contraption, I was forced to accept its demise, no heat, no funds to fix it, and no hope for a happier reunion on the horizon. I felt lost, sitting in the dark with nothing but a single flickering candle illuminating my growing loneliness, trying to rationalize my mistakes, feeling like I'd failed the three of us. An adult tasked with guiding my children into adulthood was helplessly floundering in despair. Outside the window, the storm raged on, pouring onto the roof like an angry sea. And just when I thought everything in my life had become irreparably broken, tragedy struck. I received a letter the next day, official, detailing a claim that my business had filed for bankruptcy due to prior debts I had elegantly ignored, and while the news turned my stomach, it also ignited a frantic search for solutions that led me to the one and only trust advice I had, my children. That night, I mustered every bit of courage remaining within me to knock on their bedroom doors. I could feel my heart thrumming in my throat with every knock, refusing to stop until I heard their voices muffled behind the closed doors. After hearing the grunting protests and the quick shuffle of feet, they finally let me in, and as they looked up at me, I saw a flicker of fear flash across their faces. But when I explained the mess I was in, the bankruptcy, the financial gaps, how I might lose everything, I noticed something else. They began to soften, their shoulders slumping as if the weight of their cold dismissals crumbled under the gravity of mutual fear. They came together, tears mingling with words of acceptance, reminding me of past dinners filled with love, with us agreeing to share the rent as it morphed into a plan to keep us afloat, and with it came the small sanctity of forgiveness. The next few weeks blurred together in an intricate dance of repairs, bills, and a newfound bond that slowly wove itself back into the fabric of our lives, and as it is becoming clearer now, so was the lesson I needed, that teaching responsibility did not mean sacrificing the very essence of family. The shadows that once felt so dark began to recede, like a storm after the flood. Perhaps I hadn't been entirely wrong in my initial intention. Life has a way of twisting what we think we know into something beautiful, and as our new structure solidified, I grabbed an apron and joined in on their dinner preparations, laughing until my stomach hurt, the flickering candle of my regret extinguished, replaced instead with the warming glow of healing, and the home I had feared I lost began to feel like a home again. The walls of the house that once felt so confining, now bowed around us, filled with not just love, but a promise to preserve our family even in the hardest of times, because maybe I wasn't an asshole after all, maybe a gust of harsh winds is necessary to build strength in a family, rather than tear it apart. For 15 years, I've delved into the shadows, capturing whispers of the unseen, always shuffling in the periphery. I've brushed with the cold drafts of haunted corridors, heard the phantom murmurings in abandoned homes, and witnessed flickers of presences that elude tangible reality. Ghosts, ghouls, apparitions, none have escaped my diligent ears and eyes. Each encounter reinforced a belief in their existence, their ethereal persistence in our world. My equipment, an assortment of digital recorders, EMF meters, and thermal cameras, had become extensions of myself. Over the years, I built a reputation, embracing every chilling encounter, relishing each spectral tale. Until, on a routine investigation, I faced something that shattered my understanding of paranormal. It began with an innocuous invitation from an old friend, Phoebe. "I've stumbled upon something peculiar," she wrote. Her words had the characteristic subtleties of understated horror, a promise of excitement. She spoke of a derelict mansion on the outskirts of a town forgotten by time, where the locals whispered warnings of cursed land. Eager to dive in, I seized my gear and drove through the veil of night, arriving at its crumbling gates. Vines suffocated the structure, and shattered windows yawned into darkness, promising secrets within. Inside, dust particles danced in slices of moonlight pouring through holes in the roof, each step echoing an ancient lament. Phoebe was already there, a silhouette framed by shadows, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling fervor. "It feels alive in here," she said, a mixture of thrill and fear painting her voice. As we navigated the labyrinth of decay, the air shimmered with a static energy I hadn't encountered before. I began setting up my equipment, my familiarity grounding me in the face of Phoebe's growing unease. It was then we found the room, a library, its shelves sagging under a weight of forgotten books. But it wasn't the tomes that drew our attention, it was the mirror on the far wall. Tall, with a tarnished gold frame etched with cryptic symbols, it emitted its own presence, almost beckoning. Our reflection seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed it, a flicker at the corner of my eye, an odd shift in light. My heart skipped as I focused on the mirror, watching our reflection subtly alter, like a film reel glitching, splices of scenes overlapping reality. Phoebe approached it tentatively, her fingers grazing the cold surface. That's when the mirror splashed a vision, a rift opening to a howling void. Ghastly faces twisted in silence beyond, eyes wide with malevolent hunger, puppeted by invisible strings, as if trapped eternally in their own horrors. The connection was too fast, too fierce to comprehend, yet before I could pull her back, Phoebe was gone, vanished, swallowed whole into whatever dimension this horror belonged. I was left staring at my own reflection, now standing beside those wretched specters, my heart pounding as I tried to force my mind into understanding. This was no ghost story. This was something far worse. Envisioning her trapped, forever circling in that nowhere, fed my urgency with panic. I lunged for the mirror, hands pressing against its cold surface, screaming for Phoebe, for anything, but the portal didn't yield to my will. The mirror stared back, indifferent. Days faded without sense. Sleepless, my attempts to control my equipment failed, nothing functioned to pierce the veil that took her. I became a prisoner of this reality, haunted by the memory of those ghastly expressions. When the locals came, drawn by my absence, my incoherent babbling drove them away. They sealed the mansion, fearful of the unknown. Yet, my purpose intensified, no longer satisfied with files on entities or reflections in passing. Phoebe's presence demanded restitution, demanded an understanding beyond the ethereal. The mirror remains my bridge to that other side, the tangible quest from my intangible tales. Some nights, I feel it vibrate with an energy impossible to ignore, a scream not from the past but from futures twisted into black spectacles. I've dedicated myself to unraveling its secrets, because now, in those frantic attempts to reach beyond, I wish all the benign specters of mirror lore were indeed all I had to fear, for within that mirror lies something far more voracious than any mere ghost, a hunger for souls, a manifestation of terrors once whispered around campfires, the true horrors lingering amidst our desperate night. For the past 12 years, I haven't been who you think I am, and the weight of deception is beginning to crush me. It started innocently enough back in college, when an unassuming job offer arrived one snowy afternoon, nestled between bills and junk mail. It was from a company claiming to be a groundbreaking startup, promising an opportunity that as a struggling sophomore, seemed like a godsend. All I had to do was assume a different identity. They never gave details, but the lure of financial stability blinded my judgment. I was to become Patrick Holloway, a name that almost sounded like it belonged to someone who lived by the rules, but little did I know, it was more like stepping into a vacant grave. They trained me to meld seamlessly into the skin of this persona, drilling my past, present, and future until there was no daylight between my identity and Patrick's. But Patrick had baggage, a shadow I could feel thicken behind me like fog. At first, it was just short gigs, attending events posing as this distinguished character, collecting CVs of the unsuspecting in tech circles. It was peculiar, sure, but harmless, or so I thought. The money was real, and the non-existent background of Patrick was filled with expert-crafted lies. Over time, however, the jobs became darker, involving sabotage and planting software that skimmed data from powerful companies. I was in too deep to say no. And this is where I should have stopped it all, stepped out of the ill-fitting shoes of Patrick, and confessed, but by then, I was addicted to the adventure, the semblance of power that came with being someone I wasn't. I thought I could maintain control, But my puppeteers were far more skillful. As the years passed, bonds formed around me, friendships and even a love interest named Zoe, none of which I deserved because they were based on nothing but threads of deception. I never told her the true essence of my existence. How could I? She loved the idea of Patrick, an irony-laden truth I had to swallow every day. But as I said, there's more. Recently, I started noticing that I wasn't the only Patrick Holloway. From subtle hints in emails and face-to-face encounters, I discerned there were others, different lives being run simultaneously by disposable men like myself. The Patrick-based network was vaster than I could comprehend. Every time another man failed or was discovered, he vanished without a trace, vaporized before the world knew what happened, and my fear grew as reality settled into clarity. I wasn't a unique deception but part of an industrial operation, a syndicate making use of Patrick and his ghostly brothers like living chess pieces. I tried to extract myself, but every door was sealed, leading me back into a mapped existence. The final straw came when Zoe, tired of my evasiveness, demanded to learn about my childhood. I could feel my fabricated world unraveling, brittle lines snapping under scrutiny. I had nothing of substance to give but cold fiction crafted in haste all those years ago. Before I could even consider it out, the company once again approached me, directly, men in suits who seemed to know more about my real life than I remembered myself. They told me I would be the last Patrick, the endgame moving toward culmination. I felt the noose tighten as they revealed just enough of their machinations to keep me on a precise tightrope, promising safety yet offering nothing verifiable. The final mission they orchestrated was catastrophic, a breach was inevitable, an implosion they intended to blame on me to cover all traces. With only threads connecting me to the other Patricks, I knew the others were being dismissed neatly, permanently. I realized then that my only choice was to confess, tell the fragmented world behind the screen of my shadow, and cling to the hope someone, anyone, would believe me. So, here I am, shedding the layers one confession at a time, carving an exit from an identity that isn't mine, knowing they're likely watching. The truth is, those 12 years, those acquaintances, and love not meant for me, have all built to this final plea: believe the lie was never the beginning, but merely a middle, a prelude to something more ominous and intrinsically terrifying that lays unseen, waiting for its next pun. Each keystroke feels like it might be the last one. I have long dropped the illusion of safety. This was never just my confession, consider it a warning. They're still out there, crafting new Patricks, or worse. Next time you meet someone and their story doesn't quite add up, look deeper. What rests beneath might not merely be a person, but a construct of their own unmaking. Last week I shared the eerie secrets I stumbled upon when I overheard my mother whispering in the kitchen late at night, her voice a trembling hush that seemed to draw shadows out of the corners, and what happened sent shivers racing down my spine. In my last post, I detailed how she was tangled up in a web of half-spoken phrases, words that dripped from her lips like melting wax, urging her to keep them away and that they can see us. And though I was convinced at first that it was just the musings of a sleep-deprived mind or remnants of nightmares chasing her into the waking world, there was something unsettling about her demeanor, a sharpness in her motherly warmth that made me feel like an outsider in our own home. As those whispers gnawed at my curiosity, I hung on every syllable until finally, a few nights ago, I crept down the hall, heart racing against the echoes of her warnings, and there she was again, the tension in the air thick enough to slice. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed myself against the wall to listen more closely, catching snippets of her sorrowful mutterings about the door and how it always watches, alongside the names I had never heard before, names that turned my stomach: Owen, Elijah, Clara. Each carried a weight that hinted at stories far darker than I could fathom. The mention of those names dragged up foul visions from my childhood, ghost stories told in hurried whispers on stormy nights where monsters lurked just beyond the reach of the light and nightmares danced behind closed eyes. Desperate for answers, I needed to confront her, but a part of me was terrified of what I might unravel, so I stayed silent as I watched her, convinced that within her fragile happiness lay a secret too perilous to understand, and with her big, sorrow-filled eyes, she carried an ache that seemed to tether her to a reality steeped in grief and fear. The days passed in eerie quiet, each evening as I watched the sun dip below the horizon, the shadows deepening in their embrace. I felt the suffocating pull of dread wrapping around me, until finally, I'd had enough. So that night, after she had retreated to her room, I resolved to scour the house for anything that might explain the whispers, searching desperately for clues, opening every drawer, peeling back every rug, while the darkness curled and shifted. But the mundane shelves revealed nothing except dust-riddled memories of my mother's attempts to create a warm, happy home, cluttered mementos that felt like lies, until I stumbled upon an old trunk buried beneath a tattered blanket in the closet that felt charged. Breathing beneath my fingertips, and prying the lid open, I found journals stacked neatly, their pages yellowed with age and filled with frantic scrawls, threads of her life spilling out like breadcrumbs leading me deeper into her memories. The first few entries were mundane, talks of work and dinner plans, but as the inkless pen flowed, something switched in her hand, and the words morphed into frantic rants about the house. My mother believed our home housed something sinister, something ancient and watching, and she described the way they spoke to her through whispers in the dark, naming them the keepers, claiming they predated the very ground we stood upon, luring me in with the insatiable hunger of fear, her ink detailing a history of strange occurrences, fleeting shadows darting past windows, the unsettling echoes of a child's laughter when she was alone, and then there was that dread-filled entry detailing the bedroom door, how it creaked open at 3 a.m. every night, always revealing darkness so thick it felt viscous, her plea to keep it locked and the statement repeated so many times it felt like a mantra as I clutched the pages till they threatened to tear. With every revelation, my heart raced, the weight of the words slamming down on me, and I stumbled backward as if struck by a physical force. A name leapt from the pages, Clara, the same name she whispered in the kitchen, and I froze as the gravity of it crystallized in my mind. But the latest entry was what curdled my blood, dated just a week before, where she recorded her decision to leave our house, to escape whatever dark presence lurked within its walls, and the last line sent tidal waves of horror crashing into my mind. Tonight, when the door opens again, I won't be here, I'll take them with me. In a panic, I slammed the trunk shut, my mind racing through the implications, struggling to comprehend what they meant, or who they were, when suddenly a sound froze me in place. It was a whisper, "Hello," cold whisper that snaked around the edges of fear, slithering through the air and wrapping around my throat, a voice that felt all too familiar. It was my mother, standing at the entrance of the hallway, eyes glazed and hollow, a frigid smile on her lips, and as she spoke, my heart sank. She looked right through me, a vacant shell in place of the woman I once knew, and warned me softly, "You shouldn't have read those, sweetheart. They don't like it when we talk." When I was growing up in Pyeongtaek, just a stone's throw away from the hum and buzz of the American military bases, I often heard stories of young women, like ghost tales told to children. They whispered of romances with soldiers, as though they were haunting figures who'd appear at night and vanish by dawn. My mother tried to instill fear in me with these stories, hoping they'd serve as cautionary tales to keep me away from the influence of those who occupied our lands and our lives in ways we barely understood. Yet, as a curious 27-year-old woman, these tales only added fuel to my wanderlust heart. I worked at a small cafe near the base, and the shop was a quiet haven where the sharp, scorched smell of espresso clung to the afternoon air, mixing with the ever-present hum of military chatter. That's where I met James. He was regular, always seeming to bring the chill of foreign lands with him, which hung onto his hushed southern accent like a persistent fog. There was a warmth to his eyes, a contradiction that was endearing, and before I realized it, I found myself gravitating towards him, pulled by a force that seemed both fated and forbidden. Our nights were filled with whispered secrets between sheets, and his stories of life as a soldier were often veiled with a sense of longing for normality, something I had taken for granted yet never fully understood. I became a collector of stories, words unspoken by daylight and only revealed under the protective cloak of night. At some point, somewhere between the shadows of our clandestine meetings, I started to see military men less as conquerors of land and more as prisoners of their own battles. James was shipped back to the States after his term ended, leaving an emptiness that was quickly filled by others like him. Some part of me sought closure that never came, or perhaps a redemption of sorts in helping these soldiers unburden their hearts. It became a ritual, or a confession of sorts, as each man shared his tale, sometimes about the things they did, the missions they regretted, or the families they missed back home. It was a tapestry of agony and survival woven together to create an illusion of comfort, draped over the ache of steady discontent. There was Michael, who spoke of a recurring dream of running through fields of golden wheat only to stumble and wake up gasping at the crack of dawn, and Paul, whose theremin lullabies faded slowly into the static of lonely night watches. Each narrative was a thread that wrapped around my heart, slowly constricting it until breaths felt scarce. But it was with Ethan that the reality hit. The story seeped into mine like ink into water. Ethan, who was softer than the rest, had this disquieting aura about him. His enigmatic smiles were addictively mysterious but hid cracks underneath, like porcelain teetering on the brink of shattering. He often talked about shadows, not the ones cast by real things, but those of the mind, manifestations of unspeakable things he had seen. Once, he mentioned a mission gone awry, where echoes of gunfire morphed into haunting lullabies that lulled them into restless slumbers and left their minds in dissonance. One night, amidst the silken whispers of wind outside, Ethan confessed to seeing figures in his peripheral vision, apparitions of the fallen. These spectral beings followed him, not out of malice but in a silent testament to their shared history of fragmented souls. It was during one of these recitations, as he lay breathless beside me, that the true terror took root as he mentioned the woman in white. At first, it was just glimpses, fleeting flickers out of the corner of his eye, but as time passed, her presence solidified. She bore no hostility, only a silent sorrow that encased her visage, and with each encounter, her form grew more corporeal until she was as distinguishable in the room as Ethan himself. Her visits coincided with Ethan's diminishing vitality, his breaths became gasps, and the life seemed to drain from his eyes, replaced by a haunting hollowness. It was a balmy summer night when Ethan abruptly awoke, drenched in a sweat slick with fear, his eyes wide and unseeing. He said she had spoken for the first time, her voice a melody of echoes wrapped in the wisp of a chill. She uttered words in a language that was beyond his understanding but filled with a sense of finality, a goodbye not meant for him alone. He was visibly shaken, but before I could console him, he pressed a worn photograph into my hand. It was a picture of a young girl holding hands with a soldier by a cerulean sea, happiness radiant on their faces. "She found me," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of revelation. "My sister." From then on, the woman in white was all he saw. I watched helplessly as Ethan's vibrancy ebbed away with each passing night, pulling him further into a storm of fractured recollections and forgotten faces. He was disappearing before my very eyes, like a ghost whose presence waned with the rising sun. In a final act of desperation, I reached out to people from his past, only to uncover the chilling truth: his sister vanished years ago, lost to the tides of war, her fate sealed under the guise of collateral damage. Ethan's mind had fractured irreparably, haunted by the specter of unresolved guilt and regret in forming a new reality where sapphire oceans and childhood innocence clashed violently with the monochromatic shades of life as a soldier. One sweltering August day, Ethan left. A note by his pillow mentioned a journey he must take, to reconcile with his ghosts and lay them to rest beside the woman perpetually encased in pristine white. I found out later he joined those who embarked on dangerous missions, those hell-bent on redemption or seeking refuge in the endless expanse of conflict zones. Like the others before him, Ethan became another thread interwoven into the tapestry of memories that I'd taken it upon myself to preserve, a lingering confession echoing in the hollow chambers of my heart. I still work at that cafe, each cup served a homage to tales told under the spectral gaze of moonlit nights, and with every new face that walks in, I find myself pondering not just the secrets they carry, but whether the woman in white still lingers in the shadows of those evenings long past, silently bearing witness to the lives left behind. When the advertisement for the revolutionary product popped up on my social media feed, it felt more like a godsend than a marketing ploy. The ad was simple: confession, no more onion growing or armpit smell. Antibacterial spray, guaranteed. The declaration was in bold, vibrant letters, and the testimonials beneath it spoke of life-changing freedom from odors once thought to be incurable. At first, I dismissed it as another snake oil gimmick, but after a particularly embarrassing incident at the gym where my body odor cleared the exercise room, the allure of a smell-free existence became too tempting to resist. My friends called me Rick, but the entire office had other nicknames: Stink Bomb, Funky Brewster, and my personal favorite, Ripeness Rick. Personally, I knew the real issue wasn't with my hygiene habits. My perspiration had an aggressive assault on the senses, a demonic gift from my boisterous biology that no amount of showers or clinical-strength deodorants could tame. The package arrived in an unassuming brown box, and the contents looked as innocuous as they were promising: just a small bottle with a clinical logo and that enticing phrase repeated. The instructions were simple: spray directly on the skin's problem areas once a day. As I looked in the bathroom mirror, my coif of curls sticking messily to my forehead, I gave a sarcastic toast to myself and doused each armpit liberally, and then the groin for good measure. Over the next week, the change was nothing short of miraculous. Not only did the pungent onion-like odor cease torturing my olfactory senses, I felt different. Invincible maybe. There was a pep in my step at work, a newfound confidence that stemmed from the absence of the reeking albatross around my neck. Praise replaced the thinly veiled jokes, and I even scored a date with Jessica, the cute accountant I'd been eyeing since forever. Believe it or not, the spray was more effective than I dared dream, but even I was not prepared for what came next. One evening, as I lay in bed, a deep, unyielding itch settled into the depths of my pits and groin. The sensation spread like wildfire, morphing from an irritation to an almost unbearable burning. Underneath it all, a show that my skin felt thicker, tougher. Realization dawned on me, too late. I had seen these symptoms before. They belonged to freakish headlines in the back pages of obscure paranormal tabloids. I rushed to the bathroom, splashing my face with cold water. The steam raised by my skin's unnatural heat fogged the mirror. As I raised my arms, sheer horror cascaded through my mind. Where once there had been hair, follicles dark and dense, only smooth scales glistened under the flickering bathroom light. Horrendous, rough scales that shimmered and twitched like creatures with lives of their own. Shuddering, I tried to scratch at them, tried desperately to peel them away, only for the skin beneath to pucker and tear like a rotten fruit. That night, sleep was a stranger, a blessed reprieve snatched cruelly from my grasp as the scales seemingly began their monstrous journey towards confluence, crawling and converging towards my chest, sprouting insidiously along my collars. I woke the next morning, a freshly grown festoon of scales around my neck, like a chain wrought by an unholy blacksmith. Work was impossible. I couldn't go in, couldn't allow anyone to see. My phone buzzed intermittently, the concerned faces of coworkers flashing upon it, but I remained steadfast in my refuge. Desperation clawed at my mind, driving me online for answers or solace. What I found instead were whispers, murmured accounts buried deep within dark forums, posts that hinted at a grotesque community plagued by similar battles. The advertisements were bait, promised miracles that only led to curses unimaginable. Each post a testament to the unending itchiness, to scales advancing on their own sinister journey across skin, and more disturbingly, to transformations that went far deeper. Incredulity pulled at my sanity when I read of those who claimed bipedal humanity was being snatched away from them, transitioning into creatures of nightmares, isolated, feral. The confessions diverged, some laced with the horror of relinquished limbs, others converging on a single grotesque revelation, voices, echoing, whispering, calling from the scales themselves, offers of a future, warnings of inevitability, summoning senses where none had belonged. I was at the brink of madness, spinning out of control, waves of self-loathing and panic crashing against my resolve. But behind it all lurked an unwelcome acceptance. I was only one among many. Resigned, I dragged myself to the bathroom again, witness to the grotesque spread. The mirror's surface warped as if scorched by the presence of wrongness reflected back at it. What remained of my skin seemed mere patches within a tapestry of scales, my face barely mine and something's else. I had ceased spraying after the first nights, but it was too late for defiance or regret. With each passing day, my senses expanded, cries from the scales louder, clearer. They spoke, not in words, but in impressions, emotions, urgings towards surrender, towards understanding. It was tempting, the allure of synchrony with something greater, something ancient. Grace with a twisted hue as if dipped in the miasma of forgotten eons. I had sought relief, yet found communion, their confessions imprinting upon my soul a succession of revelations I would never fathom as a man. My date with Jessica never happened, couldn't happen, really. I was withdrawn, keeping my transformation hidden from all. The support turned into resignation, and the rumors of my fate possibly wilder than the truth took on lives of their own, becoming a legend for the ages or at least until the next victim found themselves missing morning coffee due to unwanted afflictions. And as I sit here typing my confession to you, dear reader, I feel the unrepentant tug of the void, the gnawing realization that my story is but a fleeting note in the grotesque symphony conducted by the unseen hands of fate. Perhaps you will heed my warning, or maybe curiosity will lead you down a similar path to mine, into the dark company of the scales. Remember, no matter what the promise of sweet release might hold, some solutions cost far more than we are ever prepared to pay. I never thought an ultrasound photo could spark so much chaos and uncover deeply buried secrets, but here I am, regretting the day I trusted family to keep their boundaries. It all started when I decided to visit my parents in their cozy suburban home for a weekend. I was a few months pregnant, and this was the first grandchild on its way, so I knew they'd be thrilled when I shared the news. Over tea and laughter, I handed them the ultrasound images, expecting happy tears and maybe some celebratory snacks. They were ecstatic, embracing me with pure joy in their eyes. It was one of those rare moments I felt close to them. However, I insisted on keeping the pregnancy news private for just a while longer, wanting to share it on my own terms. They agreed, insisting they'd respect our wishes, and I left that weekend with a heart full of optimism. 3 weeks later, as Christmas approached, I received a peculiar email from an aunt I barely spoke to, cluttered with emojis in typical her fashion, exclaiming how adorable the announcement was, and wondering why I hadn't told her personally. Baffled, I replied asking what she meant, and she soon sent back a picture that made my heart drop. It was an elaborately designed Christmas card with the ultrasound printed right on the front, adorned with a bright header that read, "A new family member arriving soon." Taking a deep breath to curb my growing fury, I tried calling my parents, but there was no answer. I spent the day mentally scripting various confrontations, ranging from calmly inquiring about it to outright accusations of betrayal. That night, I finally got through to them. My mom answered, and before I could accuse them of turning my announcement into a spectacle, she started crying. Between her sobs and my escalating anger, she managed to spill out words that weren't what I expected. We thought you should know. You're not our only child." Puzzled, I sat in silence as she continued, "The ultrasound, darling. It's." My dad chimed in through tears. "It's at Win. We didn't know how to tell you." The room spun around me. It was a joke, it had to be. Guess my act of denying reality wasn't going to save me here. Apparently, the photo they'd used for their card wasn't the same one I'd given them after all. Their grand announcement had accidentally unveiled a hidden chapter in our family history, one I never imagined existed. When I demanded answers, the full story unraveled messily. My mom and dad had become tangled in a decade-old biological conspiracy, fueled by foolishly desperate desires. They divulged how, long ago, during a challenging phase in their marriage, they participated in a rather secretive, ethically questionable fertility program which produced embryos that had been lost and forgotten, or so they thought. They'd signed away their rights under the guise of giving those creations a chance at life, buried it in their minds, thinking it was a decision they'd never confront. Until, apparently, the clinic tracked them down just as I was pregnant, distributing their old embryos for today's technology trends, anonymously seeking surrogates and donors who unknowingly bore related children. Somehow, one of these ultrasounds, the ultrasound they mistook for mine, was actually of something far more complex, the ghost of family ties in a womb unknown. I was a living biological sibling to unnamed other siblings who had been, through some bizarre consequence of scientific playing God, reborn elsewhere. As the horrific truth sank in, my trust in all family ties eroded. My parents explained how they assumed the photo they'd received was my own, foolishly enshrining their delusion in festive glory without even confirming. They, in the bubbling excitement of unaccustomed grandparenthood anticipation, sought to extend love to whatever form our family took, not realizing the minefield they were stepping into. Disturbed yet unable to fully digest this new reality, I ended the call, numbed by confusion. The ultrasound, supposedly of my child, haunted me, layered now with daunting implications. I felt my identity fragment, and questioned the very constructs of my existence, all because of a cheerful Christmas card that set off a horror sequence of parental transparency once thought unimaginable. Suddenly, every Christmas for me would carry not just the normal stresses of the holiday but the anchored weight of this revelation, a dark legacy interrupted not by joy, but by bizarre scientific intersections and unintended consequences. I lay there into the early hours, sleep evading me, the ghostly grainy images of ultrasound swirling in my mind, signifying more than I had prepared for, dreading the new responsibilities of piecing together this shattered illusion of familial understanding. As I sit here, weeks later, clutching the real ultrasound of my very real and singular pregnancy, I question, am I the asshole for feeling betrayed, furious over something they couldn't have predicted, or for wanting to claw back the autonomy stolen from this deeply personal moment? Am I the monster for avoiding them, for seeking solace in solitude to reconcile the anxieties of kinship and science gone wrong? The Christmas card, that damned harbinger of truths I never saw, still languishes on my desk, a morbid memento I can't bear to look at, yet can't seem to dispose of. Our family is irrevocably altered, trapped in a web woven from genetic threads and holiday cheer. Its legacy and echo I fear will ominously pulsate long past the season's end, lingering much like its repercussions in our bloodline's eternity. It all started as a simple Ask Reddit thread. Someone posed the question, what's one basic hygiene thing that you see people overlooking the most? At first, responses flooded in predictably, showering, brushing teeth, washing hands, mundane stuff. But then, something strange caught my eye. A user with the ominous username The Wraith's Whisper commented, "You'd be surprised what happens when someone stops washing their hands." Curious, I clicked on their profile and was met with a series of chilling posts documenting the bizarre experiences of people who had neglected personal hygiene, all leading to a dark revelation that made my stomach knot. The thread spiraled into a nightmarish recounting of events, Starting with a group of college students who decided to stop washing their hands as an experiment, claiming they wanted to see how their bodies would adapt. The initial week was harmless enough, they joked about how they were living naturally while enjoying the freedom from soap and water. But soon, one by one, they started feeling unwell, first a headache, then a persistent cough, followed by a creeping sensation that left them uneasy. They brushed it off until a week later, one of them, a hipster named Derek, woke up with dark patches spreading across his skin, grotesquely twisting his forearm like roots breaking through concrete. Alarmed, the others tried to intervene, but Derek insisted it was just a rash, a byproduct of their hands being too clean before. The denial became a shared ritual among them, yet the nightmarish symptoms only intensified. Next, they began to hear whispers at night, quiet, rusty voices that seemed to beckon them, which they chalked up to the effects of sleep deprivation and stress. It reached a tipping point when Derek went missing, prompting a panic that gripped their friend group. Hours turned into days, and despite searching the nearby woods where they liked to hang out, Derek was nowhere to be found, leaving behind only an unsettling feeling as if a shadow had been cast over them. They gathered one last time to confront the issue, but instead of solidarity, a rift formed, accusations flew, and that's when one of the girls, Sarah, started clawing at her skin, spewing some insane idea that the whispers were from Derek himself, trying to lure them into the forest where he was hiding. Fear spread like wildfires, and one after the other, they succumbed to paranoia, spiraling away from reality. I could hardly breathe as I read the haunting claims from the Wraith's whisper. Each responding thread opened up another layer of horror. People began recounting their own encounters, and that's when I stumbled upon a response so chilling it changed everything. Someone shared their experience about a family member who had neglected hygiene to the extreme, claiming they would often complain about voices in their head, insisting that they could see things lurking behind their loved ones, staring through the veil of everyday life. They described the day their family member snapped, taking a kitchen knife while ranting about the rotten hands connected to a force that was out to get them, and in the chaos that followed, no one saw the fateful strike coming until it was too late. The authorities were called, but by then, it was too late for anything but sorrow and regret. Someone had died due to a simple disregard for hygiene. I felt the pit of unease in my gut, an instinct telling me that this thread was disturbing more than just a few isolated incidents. It was spreading, like a contagious insanity, until I couldn't shake the feeling that the Wraith's whisper knew something more, something they had experienced firsthand. That night, I lost sleep over it, clutching my phone, replaying the descriptions in my mind until I found myself spiraling down the rabbit hole of neglect, recalling every interaction and moment I'd skipped washing my hands, brushing my teeth, and I swear I could hear whispers, soft, chilling murmurs, just out of reach, every little sound reminding me of the people I'd been in contact with in the past week. I finally went to bed, heart racing, expecting hallucinations as the moonlight crept through my window, and that's when it happened. I woke up at 3 in the morning, feeling an unfamiliar weight on my chest. I sat up, heart pounding, and that's when I saw them, two dull, darkened hands hovering just above me, the fingertips blackened and crumbling, whispering my name. I stumbled back, reaching for my phone, praying it was just a trick of the mind, but the hands were real. You could see the jagged edges where skin met darkness, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to pulse with life, as if a disease-given form. In a panic, I turned on my light, only to find nothing there but an aura of something lingered, something that left a rancid scent in the air. I dared to breathe, desperate to convince myself it was just a bad dream spurred by my obsession with that thread. But every night since, the whispers grew bolder, filling my head until I couldn't tell where the dream ended and reality began. Eventually, I dove headfirst into research, unraveling more ties between hygiene and mental health. Apparently, there were long-documented cases of people experiencing complete mental breakdowns following severe neglect, hearing entities speak to them, urging them to act according to their perverse desires. But I thought I was safe. I couldn't just let something that simply be forgotten consume me, so I jumped into a shower, scrubbed every inch of skin, felt clean, and convinced myself I was no longer on that path until the day I saw my reflection morphing. First, I noticed the blackened fingertips creeping beneath my nails, and then it came, the slithery, unsettling sensation of a hand pressing against my back in the dark, eerily cold, until I couldn't move. So there I was, losing whatever semblance of reality dragged on while the fear consumed me, spiraling deeper into madness. As I began to ignore the warnings echoing in my mind, I realized I had become one of the lost, gradually succumbing to the neglect I thought I could control, the whispers growing loud until finally, I became the one who neglected their hygiene, The one who became the frightening face behind a keyboard describing their own mental collapse under the guise of anonymous validation. And now, the only question lingering in my mind is, how long until others start to hear the whispers too? When I first posted in r/amythasshole, I thought I was just venting. Who would have imagined the whole thing would unravel into a night of unearthly horror that I'm still struggling to comprehend? It began with a regular visit from my sister and her 6-year-old son, Alex. I met them in the kitchen, half listening to Alex chat about his obsession with trains, as I brewed myself a particularly large glass of iced coffee. It was one of those oversized novelty mugs, and for whatever reason that day, I needed the caffeine boost. My sister grimaced when she saw me pour it, making some passing comment about how Alex shouldn't have too much caffeine, even though I, an adult, was the only one drinking it. We laughed it off, dismissing it as another overprotective parent moment. But something shifted in Alex's demeanor as I took that first sip. His chatter stopped abruptly, his eyes fixating on the mug with a strange intensity. I thought he was just curious, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention when he whispered, "The keeper doesn't like when people drink from his cup." Shivers ran down my spine, the air becoming inexplicably heavy and cold. "Keeper? What are you talking about, Alex?" I asked, trying to maintain a light tone. He looked up, eyes wide and sincere, stating, "He's the one who watches while we sleep." I laughed nervously, thinking it was just a child's imagination spinning tales. But the atmosphere grew eerily tense, the thin line between reality and imagination blurrier than I'd like. That afternoon, the incident slipped from my mind until later when I was alone, the skies outside darkening, encased in a silence that buzzed like static electricity. As I sat in the living room scrolling through my phone, I stumbled upon a post about ancient artifacts with cursed bindings and couldn't help but think of Alex's comment. The hairs on my arm stood again when the room's temperature dropped noticeably, and the lights flickered as though arguing with the electricity to stay on. Just then, a deep, resonating hum began to echo through the walls, almost like a low growl vibrating through the house's bones. I jumped to my feet, the mug forgotten next to my phone, when I noticed a shadowy figure at the periphery of my vision, near the kitchen doorway where the mug now sat innocently enough on the counter. Moving closer, I saw it, a figure that seemed to slither before solidifying into a distinct shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its presence loomed over the small confines of my kitchen as if the very dimensions of reality bent to accommodate its form. I blinked rapidly, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the shadow stood firm. For a heartbeat, everything was silent, even the hum had stopped, and the air seemed suspended in that impossible moment. The keeper, if that's what it was, stood there, its eyes, or what seemed like the absence of them, piercing through me, with a knowing gaze that felt ancient and hollow. "You're not supposed to drink from his cup," Alex's voice echoed distantly in my mind, his innocent expression a stark contrast to the malevolent energy now suffusing the room. I felt my grip on reality loosening as the shadow swirled into an intense vortex, the room spinning crazily around me, objects rattling and clattering off their perches. Panic surged through me, a white-hot streak as I stumbled back, catching my reflection in the hallway mirror as the shadow loomed ever closer. My own reflection began to distort, twisting my features into a mask of terror until it coalesced into something else entirely, something darkly familiar, yet wholly inhuman. The terror in my mirror image's eyes screamed warnings I couldn't hear over the rising, roaring crescendo in my mind. I felt pulled toward the abyss of that black, mirthless gaze, drawn into a whispered conversation my soul ached to flee from. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the room fell silent, the shadow retracting and curling in on itself before disappearing into the depths of its own darkness. I was left gasping on the floor, the lights steady again, the air warm, deceptively normal. I glanced at the mug on the counter, the coffee half finished, knowing the mundane scene was a lie, a thin veil over the realms bleeding into my own reality. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I gathered the courage to stand and poured the remaining coffee down the sink, my fingers shaking as they clutched the slippery handle. Every sound was now a dreaded footfall to me, each rustle an echo of the nightmare I was tethered to. Alex's words lingered in the air, effigies of a truth beyond childhood fantasy, proving I had crossed into a plane not meant for people like me, intruders where we didn't belong. That night, sleep was an elusive phantom, hovering just out of reach while shadows danced mockingly at the edges of my vision, whispering secrets they alone were privy to. I was now the one who watched, the one who vigilantly guarded against the dark encroachments unraveling at the boundary between worlds. When morning spilled its forgiving light, things were different, my coffee mug now missing, an absence that screamed loudly in the glaring sunlight. Did I misplace it, or had something, no, someone, taken it as a reminder of my transgressions? I posted an AITA seeking reassurance, desperate to ground myself in the reality I had chosen to ignore for far too long, hoping someone could tell me, reassure me, that it was all just caffeine-fueled paranoia. But deep down, I knew the truth, that by simply indulging in that large glass of coffee, I'd sipped from more than just a mug but had taken a forbidden draught from a well of secrets older than time itself, and now, the keeper watches, just as Alex warned. I never believed in monsters until the night my girlfriend, Amy, disappeared, and I was forced to confront the harrowing reality that there were things lurking just beyond the edge of light. It started as a typical lazy Saturday when we decided to binge-watch our favorite horror series in my dimly lit living room filled with the scented popcorn and the tranquility of our own little bubble. I remember how we both laughed nervously at every jump scare, the kind of laughter that kept creeping eyes at bay, but as the night wore on and the credits rolled, Amy turned to me with a smile that always made my heart race, her warmth anchoring me against the vastness of the unknown, and that's when she suggested we end the night by summoning some courage and checking out that old legend about my childhood home, about the creature that supposedly lived under the bed, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Growing up, I'd always brushed it off as one of those silly stories kids told each other in the dark until the shivers crawled up my spine like icy fingers whenever I stepped into my bedroom, those shadows that twisted and contorted, as if they wanted to swallow me whole. So, being the brave souls we were, we decided to take on the spirit of the night, which was drenched in omen and dread, with me at the helm, trying to keep it light, but I felt a shift in the air. We crawled into bed with the soft orange glow of my bedside lamp painting the walls like a safety net, and I swear I felt the weight of something watching us, really watching. When I glanced under the bed, I only found old sneakers and dust bunnies, but that was nothing compared to the creeping sensation in my gut that told me we had awakened something. The first night Amy had deep, dreamless sleep while my restless mind churned through the endless tales of slumbering phantoms, until I finally drifted off, lulled by her gentle breathing. But I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. I woke up in the dark, cold sweat pooling at my sides, and as I turned to reach for her, I realized I was alone. The sheets were rumpled but empty, and my heart dropped like concrete as I called out her name into the silence that swallowed it whole. Panic gripped me, and I swung my legs over the edge, peering into the darkness under the bed like a kid facing the ultimate test. But still nothing lurked there, only shadows stretching like accusing fingers, and I swallowed my fear, thinking it might have just been a stupid prank, but deep down, I felt the oppressive weight of a secret I was yet to uncover. The hours crept by, each tick of the clock echoing louder than the last, and soon the sun began to creep through the crack in the curtains, bathing the room in a reluctant dawn. I raced out of bed and burst into the living room, my mind racing. If she was playing a prank, this wasn't funny. If she left me, my mind raced with darker thoughts, but deep down, I knew something was terrifyingly wrong. I glanced around, and my eyes fell on her phone still resting on the coffee table, screensaver lit up bright, showing our goofy faces from that last trip to the beach, an omen of the fun we had, now twisted into a reminder of the nightmare I was living in. I called her friends, scoured the neighborhood, and searched every place I thought she could go, tearing through alleys and shaking down bushes. Dread blossomed in my chest, and that familiar feeling of being watched weighed heavily, like the beast beneath my bed was mocking me. Finally, after hours of futile searching, I came back home, breathless, and sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the corner where darkness gathered like a predator lying in wait, and that's when everything shifted from horrifying to unspeakably twisted. I caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there, pale fingers with elongated nails scraping ever so slightly against the wood, a silent beckoning from the shadows that chilled my blood, and every fairy tale ever told about that thing suddenly felt so real, so tangible, like reality itself was ripping apart. And just like that, the familiar laugh of my sweet Amy echoed in my ears, but it wasn't right, the pitch was off, warped, transforming into a hiss as I felt my breath hitch in my throat, a scream trapped inside. "Let her go," I shouted into the suffocating darkness, summoning every ounce of courage I could find, but instead of releasing her, the thing beneath my bed only laughed, a low, menacing sound vibrating beneath me, filling the room with primal terror I didn't know existed. "She's mine now," it said. And those words coiled around my mind like ligature. How could I ever forget that taunting voice? Strangled on a mix of anger and fear, I grasped the nearest object I could find, a lamp, and plunged it under the bed to confront my nightmares. The lamp whirred to life, casting a flickering light that struggled against the encroaching dark, and instead of the creature, I found nothing but emptiness. In that fleeting moment of false hope, a deep, Aching chill crawled down my spine as reality splintered and tore at my insides. Realization dawned like a horrid sunrise. The beast was not after me but hunting Amy, and the panic surged once again. Because the void under my bed couldn't contain her anymore, she was lost to a world of shadows where time didn't exist, and that terrible laughter teased at the corners of my sanity. Nights turned into longer nights, and each time I slipped into the grasp of restless sleep, I'd wake only to find that I could still hear her faint cries, muffled but distinct at times, begging for release as if she were unwittingly playing into the creature's hands. I became a shell, running on fumes of a fading hope as boredom twisted into desperation, marking the calendar days with not only X's but scratches that traced the insanity bubbling beneath the skin. I reached out to anyone who would listen but was only met with pity and incredulity. No one seemed to understand, as if they too were afraid to glimpse the terror that I could see, clear as day, beneath my bed. It wasn't until the fifth night, haunted by grief and terror in equal measure, that I decided I couldn't wait any longer, that I needed to conquer my fears. I loaded up on every cliché horror weapon I could find from the dusty bottom of my closet, an old crowbar, a rusty kitchen knife, and a flashlight that flickered eerily. When my heart stopped a rhythm of dread, resonating through my body, I steeled myself and dropped onto my knees, plunging the crowbar beneath the bed, ready to fight not just the creature but also the deep, dark hole that life had become since Amy vanished. The chilling shadows retreated slightly, and for a moment, I thought hope was seeping through, but as I tugged at the cobwebs and the dust, digging deeper into the darkness, a chilling voice rasped, "You'll never take her from me," sending me spiraling back into the void and flinging the crowbar in utter disdain. I felt every fiber of my being fracture as I succumbed to despair, too preoccupied to pay any mind to the twitching shadows gathering tighter around me. I dropped the flashlight, plunging the room back into darkness, and in that twisted void, Amy's laughter swirled again, only now the timbre of it echoed with a haunting familiarity, a reminder that something had changed, and it became achingly clear that in my relentless pursuit to save her, I had awakened something far worse. With a trembling resolve, I realized that the more I struggled, the deeper I would sink, that the creature was not just a monster under the bed but a reflection of everything I couldn't face, pulling on the very threads of my existence as it tethered itself to my heart, dragging me deeper into the abyss of unfathomable loneliness. It was only in those final moments, as I prepared to abandon all hope and succumb to despair, that I felt a flicker of warmth brush against my fingers, reaching out from the dark, whispering my name, my sweet Amy, somehow live but lost. The distance echoed her words just out of reach, hollow, distant, fading beneath the weight of shadows, and in that heart-shattering moment, I realized with a paralyzing clarity, she was never safe, not even in the murmured echoes of my memories. I had given her to the shadows, and as I surrendered to the dark grips of despair, the creature's laughter rang out, a bitter reminder that in my futile fight against the darkness, it was too late. She was bound to the spirit of shadows, and I was just another lost soul wandering under a bed of twisted fears. There's something deeply unsettling about visiting a Dollar Tree at midnight, and I'm not just saying that because it's in the tropey dimly lit part of town. It started as a well-meaning gesture, offering to get groceries for my sister, who, caught up in post-divorce financial chaos, couldn't stretch her budget further. I'm her little brother, just trying to help in the only way I knew how, which, admittedly, isn't always the best. "There's a Dollar Tree near my place," I suggested, wincing internally at her pause. "They have essentials. I can pick some things up for you." She hesitated, perhaps at the idea of living off bargain store ramen and canned pears, but then said yes with a laughter that didn't reach her eyes. So, that's how I found myself here, pushing a squeaky cart under the off-kilter fluorescence, gathering what I could from sad, half-stocked shelves while the overhead speaker droned a garbled John Denver tune. I grappled with this odd guilt that weighed heavily in the pit of my stomach, wandering between aisles painted in bright, garish greens. The whole atmosphere was mildly disturbing, like time had stopped, or worse, looped. It was then that I noticed it, an elderly woman in the cereal aisle who seemed oddly misplaced, more of an apparition than a person. Her eyes were too bright and too keen, fixed on me with a grim curiosity. I tried to ignore her and continued shopping, tossing cans into my cart more aggressively than necessary, yearning for this errand to end. But she appeared again in the canned goods section, quietly staring, her presence causing a cold ripple to climb my spine. The store was empty aside from us and the lone cashier who sat slumped at the register, perhaps asleep. No one else seemed to exist in this peculiar limbo. Minutes turned surreal as she seemed to shadow me, occasionally muttering words that got lost in the ambience. "It's not just the cost. It's a curse," was all I caught one time, and it slithered like ice through my veins. I brushed it off as my imagination, After all, I'd heard the stories of haunted Dollar Trees but only in jest. Yet, the lines of reality blurred the longer I stayed. Completing my list became imperative, and I moved faster, deterring the ominous chill that followed her. But it was when I reached the freezer section, casually reaching for a box of frozen peas, that her voice became a sibilant whisper directly behind me. "Everyone pays dearly in the end," she intoned, a statement that was both solemn and sinister. I turned, heart thundering, but she vanished as though she was never there. The peas slipped from my hand. I couldn't just leave, though. I needed those groceries. Dismissing her as another hardship-clad soul in this broken place, I resumed and finally headed to the checkout, where the cashier's slow, deliberate movements seemed to twine with time itself. I handed over the meager bills, avoiding eye contact, feeling watched. The dingy plastic bags felt heavier than expected, laden with more than the cheap foodstuffs I selected. As I left, the doors hummed open with a hollow sound, and I shuffled out into a night cooler than warranted, suffused with an air of seclusion. On the drive back to my sister's, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to catch a glimpse of those piercing eyes again. The shadows clung to the empty streets, dense with inscrutable foreboding. By the time I reached her apartment complex, the nervousness had metamorphosed into a nightmarish unease. While unloading, one of the bags ruptured, my fault for overpacking, I chided myself, but as I scooped up the runaway cans, a folded slip of paper tumbled out, clearly not placed by me. I hesitated then unfurled it, revealing jagged writing that formed a message both cryptic and prophetic: "Not all deals are bargains, some take your soul for their toll." The freezing air penetrated my jacket, yet the cold wasn't just external. I rushed inside, eager to be done with the night, intending to brush off the strangeness as sleep-deprived paranoia. My sister opened the door, her smile tired yet genuinely grateful for what I'd done. In the warm familiarity of her home, the Dollar Tree encounter momentarily felt surreal. But it all shifted when her eyes fell onto the paper I'd inadvertently crumpled in my hand. Her expression darkened with recognition, and an odd, pained understanding dawned in her eyes. She asked if anyone had spoken to me, and I nodded, recounting the spectral woman's odd words. My sister, once pragmatic and steady, shuddered, retrieving a book wrapped in old, worn covers. Inside was a page with words eerily similar to the message I'd shown her, one she'd found in their old house when all fell apart. We sat in hushed trepidation, understanding then that this was more than a grocery run gone wrong. We were intertwined in an inexplicable, haunting saga beyond our mundane lives. I'd gone looking for routine survival and instead unearthed something that reached beyond the realm of our understanding, something that trailed after my sister's struggles, and now mine. Abruptly aware that this wouldn't be the last frightening whisper in the night, I held my sister close, silently vowing that whatever sought her wouldn't take more than it already had. As I left her place, I cast one final look at the remnants of the night, hoping we would find a path out of this descending dark. But even as I drove home, that same chill from the Dollar Tree lingered in the backseat like a premonition, a relentless reminder that bargains are often tricks, dressed in kind, yet sinister fashioning. At first glance, I thought my friend Mark was the kind of guy who could always make it through any situation with a smile, but everything changed when he and his longtime girlfriend, Emma, broke up after a messy ordeal that left the entire friend group shaken. I'll never forget the night they split, their argument echoing through our group chat like a digital scream that pierced the veil of our usually light-hearted banter. Mark's messages punctuated with anger and despair, while Emma's replies were cold and bitter, and as the dust settled, we were all left grappling not just with their breakup, but with the aftermath when they had a kid together, a beautiful little girl named Lily who was now caught in the crossfire of their volatile relationship. In the weeks that followed the split, Mark became increasingly isolated, leaning on me more than ever before, and as his best friend, I felt the weight of responsibility to help him navigate this treacherous emotional landscape. But the more I listened, the more confused I became. He ranted about how Emma wasn't being supportive about custody arrangements, how she was making it impossible for him to see Lily, and I wanted to help, but I didn't know how to intervene without overstepping. One night, fueled by a potent mix of concern and frustration, I reached out to Emma directly under the guise of wanting to understand, trying to keep the peace and mend bridges, but as we spoke, it quickly became clear that there was a lot more going on than Mark had revealed, and while I had initially intended it to be a simple conversation about co-parenting, it spiraled into something unexpected when she casually mentioned that Mark, in all his righteous indignation, was behind on his part of Lily's insurance, a detail that struck me like a lightning bolt because I was unsure how he had let that slip, and I made the ill-advised choice to ask her who was providing the insurance for their daughter. It was a blurted question, almost instinctual, driven by a desire to shed light on Mark's responsibilities, but when her voice turned icy and charged through the phone, I immediately regretted it, hearing her throw back a tight-lipped "why would you care?" in such a way that ricocheted through my mind, igniting a flicker of doubt about my place in this twisted saga. The next few days were filled with an uncomfortable silence between Mark and me, guilt gnawing at the edges of my conscience as I replayed that conversation too many times, wondering if I had crossed a line. But then the dagger struck when I overheard Mark sharing a painful complaint in our group chat about how I was defending Emma even though it was the last thing I ever meant to do. The idea that I was the villain in this story haunted me, tormenting me with the suspicion that I had somehow become the antithesis of what a good friend was supposed to be in Mark's eyes, and when I finally had the courage to confront him, I found a burning resentment simmering just below the surface, like he was ready to go nuclear over something that seemed entirely out of my control. So I took a deep breath and explained my side of things, desperately trying to navigate my way through this emotional minefield. But as I did, I noticed a shift in his expression, something cold and calculating, as if he was grappling with a twisted calculus in his mind, before he asked me in an accusatory tone if I thought I was some kind of hero just because I asked Emma about the insurance. And that was when it hit me hard, the realization that this tumultuous cycle was pulling me in deeper, trapping me in a drama that I had unwittingly helped escalate. I felt my heart race, the fist of panic tightening in my chest, only to be met with an odd sense of clarity. What was I even doing, trying to untangle these two lives when all I was beginning to see were the cracks they had left in my own? In the days and nights that followed, Mark's anger slowly morphed into paranoia, where every interaction felt like a dance on a razor's edge, as he began to accuse me of siding with Emma, of being a traitor for simply seeking an explanation, and I found myself trapped in this sinister web of finger-pointing and blame, desperately trying to remind him that I only wanted to help and steer our friendship back to safety. But every joke turned into a dagger and every suggestion came with a weight of hostility, and I started to lose sleep, tossing in bed as thoughts of what I could have done differently spiraled through my mind. And then, it happened. I got a call late one night, the sound of Mark's frantic voice slicing through my hazy stupor, both desperate and shattered, begging me to come over immediately because he was convinced Emma was plotting something against him, that she was trying to take Lily away forever, and my heart dropped. This was it, the moment I slowly realized I'd walked straight into a hornet's nest. I rushed over, fear pumping through my veins, expecting chaos, but when I arrived, everything was unsettlingly quiet, an airy darkness draping over the house, its shadows feeling more threatening than sinister, and as I stepped inside, the weight of dread clung to my skin, and the stillness mocked me as I searched for Mark, calling out his name through the silence. But only the echo of my voice answered back, and then his phone buzzed, the light illuminating what felt like a riddle, a series of messages from Emma. "I know what you did. He'll find out. You'll regret this," phrases that sent chills skittering down my spine, tightening around my throat like a noose, and panic surged as I realized I was knee-deep in a nightmare I had failed to escape. I began pacing, feeling the walls of the house closing in, trapped in a game that the players had yet to fully reveal, and just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard a movement in the corner, a faint rustle drawing my attention to a shadowed figure shrouded in darkness, unmoving. Watching with an intensity that sent shivers racing down my spine, but before I could even utter a word, the darkness dissolved into the melody of laughter, light, ethereal, almost mocking, and it was then that the figure emerged. A twisted smile plastered across Mark's face as the tension of the room shifted, and I realized with alarm that he was no longer just my best friend, but something darker than I had known, something tainted and transformed by the chaos of this brutal breakup, and I finally understood that I was ensnared in an intricate game, one that was spiraling out of control, where the stakes were never my heart or my loyalty, but rather our lives. I remember the night distinctly, cold air with that peculiar metallic scent that cuts the nose, reminding you you're alive. 5 years of abstinence had meant something until that moment. I was parked by the vacant lot where nothing of note usually happened, a forgotten corner of our small town everyone else seemed content to forget. The silence of the night was comforting, a far cry from the chaos within my mind. 5 years had slipped by since I first pledged to cleanse my soul from the burdens of my past. 5 years of avoiding that dark pit of memories lurking just beneath my smile. It wasn't easy, you know. Demons don't just vanish, they lurk, biding their time. They wait, patient, until you drop your guard. That night, I was perilously unarmed. I shouldn't have been driving down Old Mill Road at that hour, but there was a pull, a whisper I couldn't ignore. Ironic, considering how much I had worked on ignoring those siren calls. Parking under the dim glow of a battered street lamp, I fumbled nervously with the lighter in my pocket, flipping it open and closed in an unsteady rhythm, a metronome for the madness in my head. The object of my abstinence hadn't been drugs or alcohol, but rather something deeper, something darker that clawed at the essence of my very being. In a trembling voice I can barely identify as my own, I began to murmur my confession to the emptiness around, spilling words into the night air as though trying to exorcise a malignant entity hidden within. You see, it was never about changing the world, it was always about protecting myself from it. My descent into that hellish abyss began the day I dared pry into the forbidden crannies of the human psyche, a junkie's curiosity of the mind if you will, a sick need to unravel hidden truths best left in shadow. 5 years ago, I dabbled in what should never be dabbled with, an ancient, cursed text I found at a convention, a moment of weakness culminating in catastrophic regret. It promised insight, enlightenment, but all it gave was possession, like a festering wound that worsened the more I picked at it. With time's passing, I bottled the unholy rage within and devoted myself to abstinence, purging my soul through monotonous routines and synthetic smiles. Until now. It was this cursed Eve that drew me back. That book, its presence was too strong, it invaded my thoughts like a parasite, demanding attention, demanding obedience. And in a lapse of will I dared revisit it for closure, for an understanding I thought was attainable, and alas, I let go of 5 years of self-preservation. Yet the cruel twist of fate had its fangs buried deep. The text this time was different, rewritten or somehow transformed, as if mocking my pitiful resistance. Syllables I once deciphered with painstaking precision now leapt off the pages with cruel ease, each one etching onto my mind with a permanence I loathed yet could not escape. The whispered truths were lies, or perhaps truths too grotesque to bear. I felt hollowed out, an echo chamber for ancient sorrow. And yet, in those dreadful moments, there emerged clarity with a terrible price, a vision of intricate horrors threading through reality unseen by the naive eye. Picture this, humanity suspended by the thinnest of threads above an abyss, each strand woven from lives and stories repeating ad infinitum, a cycle unbroken save for moments of sheer truth breaching the surface of this mundane sea. For 5 long years, my abstinence had pushed me ever closer to the edge unwittingly, hemming me into this eventual return to despair. And now, the veil was lifted, the true scope of our fragility laid bare. Knowledge devoured from within just as it haunted my every waking hour. What had I exchanged my abstinence for? Nothing but an access to visions no sane mind would willingly endure. I had traded sobriety for the knowledge of harrowing inevitability, a fool's bargain, a cruel jest by entities far beyond our atrophied understanding. As I slammed the book shut, panting as though emerging from underwater, I felt the weight of those lost years pressing against me like a phantom limb. Shadows danced around the periphery of my vision, mocking my hubris, and yet sympathizing with my plight. They knew of the futility in my revelation. Wisdom brought pain, brought paralysis amidst the false hope of progress. There was no going back now. The abstinence was merely an illusion, a self-imposed exile from truths that could not be escaped. I sat there in the dim glow of streetlight, understanding at last that the only true abstinence was ignorance, and that had been shattered irrevocably. So here I am, confessing not for redemption, but to warn you of the futility in chasing truths unspeakable, in thinking that knowledge will bring peace, when it may only pave the way for ruin. I have wasted not just years, but my very being, and as the shadows draw near, I realize I must embrace the abyss I had so long attempted to ignore. Today, I turned 28, but that might be a lie because, in essence, I've pretty much been dead for over a year now. My skin still flickers to life in the mirror, a morbid flesh remainder that someone like me once existed. I remember the day it happened, the day death snuck up not with a scythe, but with a whisper, an innocuous sound almost like a promise, gossamer and forgettable, before it rooted itself deep in my ears, becoming a drumbeat that has echoed ever since. The first symptom was elusive, barely noticeable really, just a subtle shadow at the periphery of vision where none should have been. I brushed it off as the usual mind tricks, something ephemeral delusions conjure on long, uninspired workdays, but the shadows were persistent. I work remotely, which, I don't know whether to call a curse or a blessing now, but back then, isolation was my ally. It allowed me to try and ignore it all, in my home office, behind locked doors, surrounded by silence. But as any addict can attest, running away is a temporary solution. The real trouble started when the whispers began to form words, coherent, longing words echoing for life, for recognition. Human voices varied in cadence, some were familiar, and others foreign as if my mind was a global radio picking up distress signals from other worlds. Sitting at my laptop one evening, I caught a whisper that sounded painfully like my grandmother, long buried and forgotten, her voice crackling like a fire's memory. She whispered, "Come home, dear," and then silence strangled the room anew. That's when I lost time. Hours, days slipped away unnoticed, consumed in a black void of dead thoughts. Emails from my boss went unread, deadlines vanished like vapor into mist as I absorbed the growing procession of the dead calling my name. Panic clotted my chest when I realized a week had passed, and I hadn't moved from my desk. I had become a ghost, unbeheld, unfelt by my wife, Sarah, who never questioned why my office door remained shut. It seemed she, too, was fading, her presence a blur some days, and I feared asking her about it as if acknowledging would make it true. On the night of my actual 27th birthday, our small ritual celebration passed without mention of merriment. Her eyes were vacant, trained not on me but through me. The day afterward, she was gone. The world moved forward, yet I remained locked within my personal grave of darkness and whispers. Days turned into thunderous nights as the whispers grew into sing-song chants, relentless and escalating. I don't remember at what point I started responding to them, maybe out of madness, maybe through an unwelcome curiosity. "What do you want?" I begged my accusers, my own corrupted echoes thrown back at me. "To see you become," they serenaded, in riddled tongues I should not understand. In those fractured moments of dialogue, my computer screen blinked, cloaked in static like an inverted portal, the whispering now digitalized into binary volleys. Each wave a tangle of zeros and ones forming chilling instructions to follow. I ignored them at first, refusing to unravel the pages of dead words they led to, encrypted secrets from an eternal library. My hunger, however, grew insatiable, tugging me deeper into electronic wilderness where rest was for others, and I sped through data cities built by ghost logic in surreal silence. It's difficult to articulate when true reality detached, whether I drifted into sleep or simply existed in a new state of waiting. Finally, one day the whispers stopped altogether, replaced by an unyielding silence. Time slowed to a harrowing crawl, and that's when I knew, it was inevitable. I had been claimed. Somewhere in my chest, a cold steadiness thudded, each heartbeat growing softer. I became inexplicably aware of my own mortality, while paradoxically knowing it had already slipped through my fingers. Standing in front of the mirror now, reflecting a ghost with tangible skin, the last year feels like a whisper-turned nightmare from whispered promises I'd unwillingly embraced. Today, at 28, my heart beats in echoes, alive yet as silent as those burning void words that had celebrated me until now. As if bitten by unseen strings, my hands move, gripping a pen, drafting what awaits beyond. My journal quivers on the table, somewhere to anchor the memories or the semblance of what might have been. The reality I knew stretched away, always in peripheral shadows, and I wonder about fading reflections, and whether seeing myself as my own denial. My confession sits there before me, a record dictated by life and death. And still, the words in my periphery whisper hope, though I fear it's a torment wrapped in deceit. My body now serves as a vessel for things I cannot escape. Secrets permeate here like smoke invading willingly locked away doors, and I breathe it in, watching while the world celebrates a birthday for a soul that's been a ghost, lingering at 28. It was the hottest summer day we'd had all year when my so-called friend Lisa asked me to accompany her to the county fair. I should have known something was off when she insisted we ditch our group and go alone. Just us and the blazing sun, dragging our shoes through melting asphalt as vapors seemed to rise like ghostly fingers around us. After a couple of hours enduring the heat and overpriced rides that seemed to spin on forever, I found solace in the form of a shimmering ice cream truck, its presence a beacon of hope in the undulating waves of heat. I splurged on a double scoop of cookies and cream, the cold sweetness melting perfectly against my tongue, easing the fire that lived in my chest. Lisa had scoffed at the idea, her face twisted in mock disgust as she turned down my offer to get her a cone. "I can't bear the calories," she said, inspecting her reflection in the small mirror she always carried. But now, as we strolled past the Ferris wheel, its chains groaning like echoing whale songs caught in storms, she changed her tune. "Let me have a lick," she said suddenly, her eyes glinting in a way that made my grip on the cone tighten involuntarily. Perhaps it was the outlandish request or the way she said it, half command, half supernatural demand, but a chill snaked down my spine not unlike the frost of the treat I held. "No," I said simply, with a laugh I hoped sounded nonchalant, but in truth, her bizarre entitlement to my dessert had triggered a primal sense of protectiveness over such an innocent pleasure. Her smile faltered slightly, a storm brewing beneath her mascara-laden lashes. A rustle of whispers seemed to swirl between us, though the fairground was sparse, nearly deserted but for the echoes of distant screams of joy and terror from the rickety roller coaster. It was as if the air hung heavy and pregnant with something unsaid. "You're serious?" she asked, her voice lilting upwards like the cracked notes of an untuned piano. "It's just one lick, don't be such a control freak." But beneath her words lay an undercurrent I'd never noticed, and suddenly the world seemed slightly askew, like a picture frame hung deliberately askew so your eyes would constantly twitch. "Yes. It's mine," I blurted, fully aware of how childish it sounded but driven by some instinct I couldn't ignore. Her eyes flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows on the ground. A gust of wind wrapped around us, cold like a lover's absent touch in the solitude of night. The air felt thicker, as though teeming with something unseen and intangible. Lisa pursed her lips, a daguerreotype of discontent flashing across her face, and for a disorienting moment, I thought I glimpsed something behind her eyes, a ripple of darkness, an ancient emptiness, that seemed to reach out like tendrils from an abyss. Just for a moment, the fair's noises dimmed, the vibrant colors drained away, and I felt inexplicably hollow, my heart pounded with an urgent pulse echoing inside my head. Her gaze pierced through me, and without words, she somehow commanded an awful dread. "It's just ice cream," she repeated slowly, her voice reverberating like stones skipping across haunted lakes. Her persistence unnerved me, and every fiber of my being screamed that her insistence was far from normal, laced with an unnatural insistence that transcended the simple act of sharing. "No," I replied again, firmer this time, pulling the ice cream cone closer to my chest like an ancient relic warding off unseen evils. Her face, a perfect mask of frustration, twisted momentarily before smoothing back into placid beauty. Yet, her eyes flickered, as if suppressing some arctic ferocity lurking beneath her skin. Time dilated between us, and I swear shadows slithered with malignant cadence across the fraying edges of my perception. "Fine," she said finally, her voice an unexpected melody of defeat, and the shadows retracted, leaving me with the buzzing tension of cicadas and sweltering silence. I expected her to storm away in predictable anger, but instead, she lingered, her smile unwavering, as if she were communing with something that lay between the folds of reality only she could perceive. Something wicked brushed against my consciousness, sly and serpentine, whispering untold truths and promises in a language I couldn't understand. With growing unease, I watched as she turned, retracing our steps, her figure seemingly fading into leaden clouds as she walked away. An oppressive weight lifted, and I inhaled sharply, only then realizing how shallow my breaths had been. I felt no victory, only an unknowable loss as I cradled my rapidly melting solace, dripping unwasted onto the earth. But as Lisa disappeared amidst the throng of swaying bodies, I noticed a curious thing. A chill emanated from her previous presence, frost spread across the ground in her wake, glistening like shattered glass or the teeth of a malevolent winter. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, questioning my sanity. And that night, as I lay in bed, dream sitters perched upon my chest, pressing silence into my broken dreams. She visited me again, countless voids swirling in her ever-demanding eyes, whispering cryptic tendrils of sounds that tugged at the seams of my reality. Over and over, the haunting mantra of "it's just ice cream" rung louder than the tormented wails of long-forgotten souls, and with each reiteration, I grew more convinced that not all who wander through shadows emerge the same, for some shadows carry themselves as invitations to nightmares. It was when I could no longer discern waking moments from the nightmares that took root deep within my slumber that I realized her request was never about the ice cream, it was a test of possession, a sinister key to untold doorways. Now every night, that familiar whisper toys with my sanity, and somehow I know, a simple lick would have bound me there, in her grip, forever enslaved to whatever entities she served. Am I the asshole? Maybe. Or perhaps not, because this was never as sweet and simple as ice cream. Was it? When the shattering of glass echoed through our cramped living room, it wasn't just the vase that broke. It was the thin facade I had been holding onto for months. Sitting there in the dull glow of our flickering TV, surrounded by the remnants of failed dreams and a miscarriage that left me hollow, I stared at my mother, a beacon of possibility holding onto a secret of her own. There was a time I would have thought destiny had a cruel sense of humor, but this went beyond any cosmic jest. I was 28 when the ultrasound technician broke the news. The nursery remained unused, the walls still adorned with soft yellow birds ready to greet a life that never came. My mother, at 52, had shuffled into my room shortly after, her face an unreadable mask, clutching her stomach with a wild disbelief that mirrored my own. "You're going to have a sibling," she had said, as if the weight of her words was something we could both bear. And we, unwilling conspirators in this twisted play, carried on our lives. Beneath the smiles at family gatherings was the gnawing void of a child I never met, And the world wasn't aware of the story blooming in our midst, an impossible pregnancy that seemed more like a fairy tale spun by lunatics than reality. To cope, I nestled into routine, drowning under its predictability until the unexpected visit from Tom, my typically reticent brother. He stood in the doorway, fidgeting, eyes darting like a moth caught in undulating candlelight. "Sarah's pregnant," he blurted, the silence that followed tethered with the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Here was a tale we dared not even whisper, lest the fragile web of secrets binding us tear apart at the seams. Our parents were away at a doctor visit, leaving us alone to reckon with the strangest luck akin to staring down a cracked, antique mirror reflecting fractured destinies. Every long-forgotten resentment seemed to claw back into our minds, relentless and fervent, unrelated yet entirely connected. I often find myself gazing out the kitchen window at the dusk settling in like a bedraggled stranger making itself at home, pondering why fate chose our family for its sinister experiments. I follow the mundane, yet peculiar rhythms of our household, the scrape of forks against plates, the muffled arguments through thin walls, all while enduring the cacophony of blessings and curses from this supposed stroke of impossible luck. With each passing day, my mother grew rounder, her resilience like a pioneer venturing into the unknown wilderness. And as her due date crept closer, Tom's apprehension swelled, the shadow of his impending fatherhood looming, a specter feeding the desperation in his eyes. The night my mother went into labor, an unseasonable storm raged outside, tearing at her house with icy fingers as if eager to capture any warmth and joy before it could take root. I drove her to the hospital, shooting anxious glances towards the back seat where she panted and grimaced. Memories of my own time in the hospital washed over me, flecking the air with an inescapable déjà vu that settled around us like dust on rarely touched surfaces. I had rehearsed everything I would tell her at that moment, the doubt, the fear, the unyielding sorrow. But instead, the words dissolved, leaving only silence. Then, after hours that seemed like days, my brother's baby joined the world with the same abruptness as the squall outside. We stood at opposite ends of the maternity ward, each enveloped in our own minds' narratives, punctuated only by the cries of new life. Tom couldn't know the turmoil I experienced as I watched him cradling his tiny, wrinkled daughter, a bizarre echo of the joy stolen from me. In the adjacent room, my mother lay holding her newborn son, radiance and exhaustion etched in equal measure across her face. The two halves of my new world collided there under harsh, sterile fluorescent lights, beginnings unimagined, endings I still grieved. Standing at that strange crossroads, I understood the uncanny cycle spinning us all into an uncertain future, this shared, inexplicable dance my family and I stumbled through, where the miscarriage, the new brother, and my brother's child were confusing notes in a song none of us had intended to play. It dawned then like a blade slipping between ribs, that life was stretching around us in its timeless web, pulling strands taut and bringing us to our knees, making us acknowledge a mortality as inescapable as the setting sun outside the window. And so, we stood there, a family reborn through unexplainable means, a daughter who had lost but gained in the most surreal form, a son now a father shadowed by century-old wisdom, and a mother traversing earthly and unearthly boundaries as nonchalantly as a walk in the park. Could this be real? I ponder as the hospital smells fade into the background, overwhelmed by the overpowering scent of new life tempered with a twang of bitterness. Fate had given us wretched uncertainty packaged within miraculous opportunities. As I leave the hospital, squinting against the pre-dawn light, a strange resolution casts its light across my bewildered heart, realizing that our story was merely a new chapter in an endless, unpredictable, and reckless book of life itself. When I was a kid, my grandmother often spoke in hushed tones about a woman named Eliza who lived on the outskirts of our small town. To her, Eliza wasn't just an urban legend but a terrifying memory from her youth, and my grandmother insisted that anyone brave enough to venture too close to her rickety old house at night could hear the soft sobs of a mother mourning her lost child, a child who had disappeared one fateful night over 50 years ago, a legend so horrifying that it seeped into the very bones of our community, leading to a whispered rule: never wander near Eliza's home after dark. Of course, as kids are wont to do, my friends and I scoffed at the fear that gripped the adults. Sitting around a flickering campfire one summer night, we dared each other to prove that Eliza was nothing more than a figment of our imaginations, so we hatched a plan to go to her house, which, as fate would have it, was only a few blocks away, hidden behind twisting trees that seemed to grab at us in warning with their gnarled branches as we walked, hearts pounding in our chests, the night air thick with the scent of damp earth and the whispers of our parents echoing in our ears. When we finally arrived, the house loomed before us, a crooked silhouette against the starry sky, and as we crept toward it, the stories flooded back, each one more terrifying than the last, tales of Eliza's sorrow, about how she had once been a joyful mother, blissfully unaware that her life would shatter the day her child went missing near the shadowy woods surrounding her home. And just when we thought we were brave enough, we heard it, a faint crying, so soft and delicate it sent a chill down my spine, and my instincts screamed for me to turn back, but our foolish pride pushed us forward. We gathered the courage to knock on the warped wooden door, which creaked open as if it had been waiting for us, revealing an entryway shrouded in darkness, where the shadows seemed to dance, beckoning us inside. And as we stepped over the threshold, the air grew cold, an unnatural chill that felt as if it were alive. Our flashlights flickered uncertainly, and we felt like intruders, yet something compelled us to press on, to uncover the truth that every adult had tried so hard to keep from us, for the very walls of that decaying house seemed to sigh with a longing that resonated deep within our bones. As we ventured further, we stumbled upon a dusty hallway lined with photographs that captured moments of unbearable happiness, each one showcasing a mother and her child, until we found one in particular that caught my breath. It was a picture of Eliza, her arms wrapped lovingly around a small girl with bright eyes that seemed to glimmer in the faded light, and seeing them together ignited a sense of profound sorrow within me, almost as if I could feel the ache of loss echoing through time, when one of my friends, Jake, called my name, his voice quaking, as he had discovered a door at the end of the hall, and despite the chill that ran down my spine like icy fingers, I felt an unexplainable pull to follow him. We pushed the door open, revealing a small, dark room dimly lit by an old lantern that flickered on its last legs. The walls were covered in frantic scrawls of memories, names, dates, drawings of children playing, and at that moment, the crying grew louder, reverberating in my ears, drowning out our frantic breathing, as the lantern's light illuminated the heartbreaking sight of Eliza herself, a frantic figure hunched over a pile of tattered toys, her hair falling over her face like a curtain of despair, and she wailed into the emptiness, "Please come back to me." As if we were the very child she had lost all those years ago, and in that moment, terror gripped us like a vice. We turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping us inside her sorrow. As she lifted her head, revealing eyes that shimmered with both madness and longing, and I realized then the truth that had led our parents to shield us from her story. Eliza wasn't just a mother mourning her child, she had become a vessel of that loss, a creature of the dark who would take any child who dared disturb her sorrowful solitude. And as we screamed and pounded on the door, desperate to escape, I glanced back, and our eyes met for just a fleeting moment before she opened her mouth wide and let out a scream that would haunt my nightmares. It was not just the sound of a woman, but the collective anguish of every person she had ever lost, filling the room with their grief. And without any warning, the toys around her began to move, twisting and turning as if they were alive, and I could feel the very air grow thick with despair, tendrils of darkness reaching for us, the desperate cries of misplaced innocence echoing through the room sharper than any blade. In the chaos that followed, we managed to pry the door open just wide enough to slip through, stumbling back into the night as the lantern flickered and extinguished, plunging the room back into oppressive darkness. And as we raced out of the house, I glanced back one last time to see her standing there, framed by the doorway, an ethereal silhouette lost in shadows, frozen in grief, but the haunting look in her eyes was enough to send us staring down the street, too terrified to even speak of what we had witnessed. To this day, I've never told anyone about that night, too afraid that the memories will resurface and attract her attention. I know the stories remain alive, for every year on the anniversary of the disappearance, the cries of a grieving mother can still be heard echoing through the town, and the children whisper as they creep past her house, ever wary of the legend that isn't just a tale spun from morbid curiosity, but a warning, because once you hear her sobs, she knows you, and the longing in her heart can become a darkness that seeks to fill the void left by her child. So, remember, if you ever find yourself near a rickety old house at night and you hear the cries of a mother, run. I never thought I'd hear from Sarah again. It had been 3 years since our messy breakup, one where she had stormed out of my life, leaving only a cryptic voicemail that felt more like a threat than a farewell. So, when I saw her name flash on my phone one dull afternoon, my heart did a somersault, the way it used to when we were intimately entwined, making promises we both knew we could never keep. I hesitated, a flood of memories crashing over me, but the curiosity won out. I answered. "Hello?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's me," she replied, her tone eerily calm, void of the storming emotions I'd expected. It felt too measured, too rehearsed. "Can we talk?" I should have said no, should have hurled my phone against the wall, but instead, I swallowed hard and nodded to the air as if she could see me, agreeing to meet in that old cafe we used to haunt. My gut twisted with premonition as I arrived, the creaky table in the dim light bringing back both the warmth and the darkness of those coffee-fueled conversations. She was already there, her dark hair longer now, cascading over her shoulders like a curtain hiding a chaotic world behind it. "You look well," I managed to say, the awkward silence thickening our surroundings.
"Thanks,"
she replied, but there was a certain vacancy behind her smile that caught me off guard. We exchanged pleasantries, small talk that felt wickedly false, but then she leaned closer, her voice dropping into secrecy. "I need to tell you something. It's about what happened that day." My blood ran cold. That day, the day she left, was a haze of anger, hurt, and confusion, yet an electric thrill of anxiety jolted through me as if I were the one sitting in the electric chair of memories. She took a deep breath, her fists curling together on the table, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. "I never wanted to leave, you know. I had to. There was something I couldn't explain." The weight of her words was heavy as they dangled between us like a fleeting ghost, and it became hard to breathe. "What do you mean?" I leaned in, my heart racing. Her eyes darted to the crowded cafe, as if searching for something or someone in the throng of oblivious patrons sipping their coffees. "You don't remember, do you? What we found in the woods?" The casual mention of those woods sent chills across my skin. Memories of that strange Saturday flooded back, the day we stumbled upon a desolate cabin while hiking, filled with unsettling trinkets and a thick, musty air that clung to us as we left. "I thought it was just some old folklore," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But you said you saw something, Sarah. You said you saw something in the window." For a brief instant, shadows clung to her features, and the lightness of our past faded as she murmured, "I saw you." My blood went icy as I processed the admission. "What do you mean? It wasn't just a coincidence. You've always been different, haven't you? The way you feel when things get tense, the shadow that creeps into your eyes when you're too focused. It's why I had to leave." She paused, drawing a shaky breath, eyes wide but seemingly lost in another world. "You were connected to that thing in the woods. I thought I could ignore it, but it followed me. All these years, it..." She hesitated as if struggling to form a link to her frayed narrative. "It was in my thoughts, in my dreams, but now it's angry. When I try to sleep, it whispers to me. It wants out." My heart thundered in my chest, a primal instinct welled within. "What do you mean, it wants out?" I asked cautiously, amped up on adrenaline and dread. She looked around again, and this time, she didn't hide the fear etched into her expression. "It only shows itself when you remember." At that moment, the flickering of overhead lights gave me pause. The whole cafe grew dimmer as people around us went still, as if in synchronized dismay. I tried to shake it off, when suddenly Sarah's gaze lashed to a spot directly behind me, her breath hitching. "It's here, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice quaking with terror. I turned, the hairs on my neck prickling with dread. Nothing but empty chairs and marauding shadows behind me, and yet I could feel it pressing close, feel the silence like a weighted blanket. What do I do? I felt paralyzed, not just from fear but from the visceral connection to Sarah, memories flooding back too vividly. "You have to remember," she urged, her hand gripping mine tightly, "you have to help me." Just as the chairs began to rattle and the air thickened with unrest, a voice whispered from the depths of my mind, and in that split second, images flickered, that cabin, the fractured mirror inside, and that moment, the moment when I saw my reflection but not my own eyes. They were black as pitch, swirling like endless vacuum, a void looking back at me. Horror gripped my heart, and I knew then what she meant. "The thing, it's inside me, isn't it?" The truth clawed its way out as I realized the connection between us wasn't just love, but something darker. It had spread like vine through our lives, and now we were ensnared together in the rippling aftermath of our choices. "We're cursed," I murmured, the revelation dawning heavy on my soul. She nodded, tears shimmering like glass as they left trails down her cheeks. "We have to break it, together." "But how?" I choked out, as frantic energy pulsed in the air around us, a restless entity weaving itself into the fabric of our reunion. I could feel it now, the intertwined fates that twisted us into a labyrinth, all stemming from that day. "I don't know, but we'll figure it out," she said, her voice gaining strength. Just as desperation gripped us anew, a shadow flitted across my peripheral vision, a dark figure standing just outside the cafe window, watching us. Panic ensued in my mind, fragments of faded memories igniting into a vivid frenzy. I squeezed her hand tighter, determination rising in a rush, but what lay ahead felt insurmountable. The cafe erupted in chaos, the patrons screaming, eyes glued to the darkness at the window, yet all I could think of was how the love we shared spiraled us into this madness. As I looked into her eyes, I realized she was right, The darkness craved our memories, it lived for them. But we couldn't roll our eyes and sleep anymore, we had to confront it together, even if it meant facing not just the shadows of our past, but also the horror of what we had become. "Let's do this," I said, steeling my resolve, but deep down, a chilling voice whispered, perhaps it was already too late. The reality of our fates was already stitched into the world that had witnessed us. Our ex-love didn't just want to talk, it demanded a reckoning. Last winter, my family took our annual trip to the mountain resort, a treasured time filled with laughter and hot cocoa, but it turned into a nightmarish descent no one could have anticipated. With the picturesque snowflakes swirling in the air and cheerful skiers carving paths down golden trails, my son, only 10, had finally mustered the courage to venture onto the slopes without my constant supervision. I felt a mix of pride and anxiety watching him navigate the gentle slope, laughing alongside other kids. Then, as I sipped my coffee while ensconced in the vibrant lodge, I witnessed a flash of movement, a dirty red ski jacket that barreled out of control like a rogue comet. I leapt from my seat, heart racing, and just like that, my little boy was knocked off his feet by a middle-aged man obviously far too invested in his own speed. I rushed outside to find my son sprawled in the snow, disoriented and bruised, his mouth twisted in pain. The man was now standing over him, nonchalant, looking less like an apologetic skier and more like a cat watching a startled mouse. In those moments, my instincts took the reins. The man muttered some half-baked excuses, his words slurred as though he'd started drinking before the lifts opened, shrugging off the incident with a wave of his hand, and that unfamiliar rage ignited inside me, fueled by the protective desperation of a father. I couldn't just let it go, I couldn't allow my son to think such careless behavior was acceptable, so I made an impulsive decision to call ski patrol, fingers trembling as I dialed the emergency number, knowing that the words he hit my son would spill out like poison, bringing consequences I couldn't foresee. As I reported the reckless skier, the man's eyes blazed with a mix of fury and disbelief, and before I realized it, the situation had escalated. He squared his shoulders, his eyes darkening into something primal and cold, his voice suddenly smooth and dripping with arrogance as he pointed a finger at me, taunting, "You think they're going to believe you over me? You don't even know what you're doing, do you?" His words clawed through the chaos like fingernails on a chalkboard, but I held my ground, now feeling the weight of my decision bearing down on me like heavy snows during a storm. When the ski patrol arrived, their expressions etched with confusion, I told them everything without hesitation, my son nodding solemnly, and the man's bluster crumbled just slightly, perilously close to slipping into regret, but deep down, I could sense that didn't matter to him. The only thing that replayed in his mind was an overwhelming desire not to be inconvenienced. The patrol ended up escorting him away. My son was okay, not physically harmed but shaken, and the man was handed a citation, his red-faced fury boiling over the moment they took him aside. But I felt the repercussions, the kind of accountability you could never anticipate. Days turned to weeks, and after the dust settled, anonymous messages began surfacing, each more insidious than the last. "AITA for ruining another man's life?" echoed through my mind, dark letters haunting my waking hours. The first message was on social media, anonymous threats creeping in like shadows, taunting me, "Hope you're proud of casting your son in the role of the victim while you tear a man apart," and the fear wormed its way into my chest because somehow, the backlash was now at my door. The man had followers, a whole legion of defenders who raged against my perceived injustice. I brushed it off at first, but slowly, those messages multiplied, picking apart every moment of that day, every detail that cast doubt on my sincerity, attempting to portray me as a villain cloaked in fatherly intentions. It became hauntingly clear that the innocent hike we'd envisioned had turned into a complete upheaval of safety and sanity. My son no longer wanted to ski, terrified to step foot on the very slopes he once loved. My nights filled with anxiety, pacing the house until dawn while my son lay asleep. I dreaded the thought of what repercussions would play out next. When the doorbell rang at 2 in the morning, I felt my heart drop cold and heavy as I realized it was the man, his entire demeanor of an air of calm cloaked over barely contained rage. "You think I would let this go? You've turned your son against me," he spat out, leaning into the darkness. The moment he stepped over the threshold, my instincts screamed for survival, and every nerve in me reacted, but the noise of my thoughts was drowned by a chilling wave of dread, knowing I had unleashed something west of chaotic. I wasn't shaking just out of fear, I was shaking because deep inside, I feared that maybe I had become the real monster in this story, no longer the protector of my child but a catalyst for the storm that threatened to swallow everything. He leaned forward, and in that moment, his devilish grin was terrifyingly close. Behind him loomed the shadows of what was about to happen, and all I could think as I grasped for the emergency phone was that I might have unwittingly opened Pandora's box, unleashing consequences that could never be taken back. I should have just taken the other elevator. That thought ran through my mind repeatedly as I stood frozen in the metallic confines of the small, flickering lit elevator that was currently descending into the depths of the crumbling apartment complex I had moved into just 6 months ago. It wasn't my first choice, but I had been desperate and the rent was cheap. The windows barely opened, and the walls were riddled with cracks that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't quite grasp. As the elevator slowed to a stop, an unsettling jolt that sent a shiver down my spine, my gut twisted, warning me of the dread that lay beyond those doors. I had noticed oddities since I'd moved in, strange noises echoing through the walls at odd hours, shadows darting just out of sight, an overwhelming sense of being watched that clung to me like a wet blanket. Still, I disregarded the warnings. Who wouldn't want to save a few bucks? Gathering my courage, I pressed the button marked B for basement, hoping to retrieve another box of my belongings that I had hastily shoved in storage during my move-in, the apartment being too small for my amassed junk. The elevator was cramped, smelling of rust and something vaguely akin to mold, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand until the lights flicked ominously, cutting out for a heartbeat and plunging me into darkness. Then, the fluorescent lights flickered back to life and I caught a fleeting glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, something long and pale, trailing shadows, but when I turned my head, there was nothing. My heart began to race, the quiet hum of my own breathing mingling with my mounting anxiety as I tried to shake off the encounter. A moment later, the elevator doors creaked open with a jarring shudder, revealing the cavernous basement that felt more like a tomb than a storage area. I stepped out cautiously, the stale air hitting my face like a brick, and my eyes struggled to adjust to the dim lighting of the overhead bulbs that swayed like pendulums above me. A faint neon sign flickered in the distance, illuminating a long corridor lined with locked doors, each numbered but largely forgotten, as I made my way past in search of my unit. But then I stumbled across something strange, an open door, its darkness yawning like a mouth ready to swallow me whole, and alongside it were muffled thuds and soft cries, an unmistakable sound of a struggle. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but curiosity drove me closer, my feet almost moving of their own volition as I peered inside. What I saw chilled my blood. A young woman, disheveled and wild-eyed, was chained to the wall, her body trembling as she looked up at me, desperation etched into her face, and before I could utter a word, a voice, a deep, guttural growl, rumbled from the shadows, "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled back, realizing with dawning horror that the voice belonged to something hunched and distorted just out of sight, draped in what seemed to be rags that faintly glistened with remnants of something unspeakable. I turned to run, but another voice called calmly to me, a young boy's voice echoing from down the hall, "Help my sister, please." Panic surged through me, and I wrestled with my gut, knowing this was wrong. Everything about this felt wrong, yet my feet were shackled by an unseen force, an unrelenting compulsion to linger. "You weren't supposed to take this elevator," the growl came again, closer this time, sending a shock of fear down my spine as I bolted towards the exit, my heart pounding relentlessly against my ribcage. Terrified, I barreled my way back through the door and into that insipid elevator, slamming the button for the ground floor so hard I was surprised it didn't shatter under my force. As the elevator lurched upward, I thought I was safe, that I had escaped whatever nightmare lurked in the basement. But the lights flickered again, more dark than flicker, and the air shifted in that confined space. The hum turned to an agonizing growl, and then suddenly the elevator stopped with a harsh metallic clang. I felt a presence behind me, an otherworldly chill that crawled along my back, creeping up my neck. I dared not turn around but could feel the suffocating weight of something sinister, right there. The mirrors against the elevator walls began to warp, the reflection twisting into an elongated face with hollow eyes, a mouth stretched into a horrid smile that didn't belong in this world. "You're not getting away that easily," it hissed, and I screamed, a raw sound clawing its way out of my throat as I pounded against the elevator doors, desperate to escape. Finally, with a violent burst, the doors flew open, and I stumbled out, gasping for breath, finding myself standing in the lobby of my building. I glanced back at the elevator, hoping against hope that whatever had been lurking there wasn't following me, and turned to run for the exit just as the lights flickered one last time. But in that flickering light, I caught sight of the boy from the basement standing in the corner, his eyes pleading and wide, not for help but for my silence, a warning. I fled into the night, the air rushing past me, not daring to look back, the weight of what I'd seen pressing upon me like a leaden blanket. It wasn't until I reached my car, keys trembling in my hand, that I realized I hadn't just escaped, I had left them behind. and though the streets flooded past me as I drove home, I felt the unbearable burden of their haunting cries clawing at my sanity. What I had witnessed in that basement would never truly leave me. I should have just taken the other elevator. I used to joke that my wife, Sarah, was indestructible. After surviving a plane crash in the Andes, you might say she earned the title. She came back with just a limp and an unfathomable story about survival. So, when I stumbled across an obituary with her name on an obscure genealogy site, my immediate thought was that it was some kind of bizarre clerical error. Sarah found my initial panic amusing, leaning in with her ever-enigmatic smile as she bent to kiss the top of my head, but the nagging feeling stuck with me like a bad smell. However, curiosity got the better of the indomitable woman sitting beside me, and she began probing the internet for more links. Each one seemed more unsettling than the last: forums, news articles detailing her alleged death, and then memorial pages with hundreds of condolences from strangers. I mean, honestly, she chuckled nervously, "Do I look like a ghost to you?" But as days turned to weeks, her humor dimmed into troubled silence. I could see the confusion tightening its grip around her, turning laughter to unease. It turned worse when strange calls began trickling in, people claiming to be distant relatives, speaking in hushed, erratic tones about family matters and unsettlingly vague phrases like "unfinished business." At first, we ignored them, attributing the influx to the digital era's many mysterious algorithms gone haywire. Yet, some were far too detailed, referencing events in Sarah's life only known to close family and, in some creepy cases, things even she didn't remember. Then came the man at the door, a nondescript visitor in a gray trench coat, his face forgettable except for the shadowed eyes that betrayed no sign of warmth. His voice had been unsettlingly soft, yet carried an ominous certainty when he said, "I know who she is," gesturing towards Sarah with a knowing nod. The room grew chillingly quiet, and for the first time, I sensed a shift in Sarah, an unease, hinting at some repressed fragment of knowledge stirring within her. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper, "I need to know more." We fell into a deep dive of research, poring over archives and databases, reaching out to anyone who might provide a clue. During those feverish nights, unexplainable oddities began to unfurl around us. Objects weren't where we'd left them, shadows slithered where light should pierce, and the air at home felt charged, thick with unseen static. Even her reflection seemed wrong at times, subtly off, as if mimicking her actions with an infuriatingly slight delay. One particularly fraught night, Sarah opened up to me, delving into a memory long buried, or suppressed. As she spoke of moments from her childhood that didn't fit, déjà vu that plagued her life, she became different, her words mirroring entries from digital fragments we pieced together. We delved into her past, contacting everyone from childhood teachers to old friends to confirm minute details of her life. Each conversation left us with more questions than answers, piling fragments of inconsistency upon the growing mountain. Then came the photographs, box after box unearthed from dusty attic corners. Portraits that were both comforting and disturbing, where an uncanny doubling seemed prevalent. Sarah's face appeared beside a shade of herself, a mirage in frame, yet consistently there, two smiling mirrors of memory. Finally, after weeks of soul-crushing doubt and fear, we discovered an unnervingly succinct note slipped under our door, penned in beautiful yet chillingly foreign script: "Look beneath the surface." This cryptic message launched us further down the rabbit hole into territories bordering mysticism and science fiction. As if our lives had been co-opted into an elaborate narrative woven by some unseen hand. A visit to an obscure historian confirmed our worst suspicions. His study reeked of dust, filled with relics and theories about doppelgangers and parallel lives. Trusting him seemed absurd, yet, desperation makes fools of us all. He spoke of a rare phenomenon: sometimes, a life out of its place seeks balance by manifesting in two realities, each operant but detached from its counterpart. According to him, Sarah's survival in the Andes had threaded her soul into a different tapestry, her essence now straddling realities. "Basic quantum theory," he muttered almost casually, though his eyes glinted with an intensity that belied simple science. The world felt upside down, and I realized the woman beside me was neither fully who I thought, nor entirely someone else, a notion terrifying and awe-inspiring. In hindsight, I think that mad chase for truth was the longest dream I have yet to wake from. Yet, no amount of rationality could erase that chilling morning's revelation. The historian's parting words echo even now: "Hold on to what you love, even if sometimes, it's like trying to grasp water. But remember, water never loses its shape." As cryptic as ever, those words now hold a tangible meaning. Even today, reality glitches, when Sarah's touch doesn't send tingling warmth, or when in the mirror her expression just lags. The obituary remains a cruel reminder of a paradox unsolvable yet inescapable. We do not speak of it anymore, instead, we revel in this shared existence, this intricate dance between worlds unknown. But sometimes, just sometimes when rain falls too hard or silence stretches too thin, I catch her eye and see a dreamy distance spanning an infinity none but she can see. Her smile follows, wistfully, and I know a part of her is forever bound elsewhere, whispering truths only shadows hear. Yet, beyond it all, we continue. For after all, indestructible is less about surviving and more about being remembered in whatever form fate might demand. It all started as a harmless inquiry on AskReddit. A curious user posed the question, people who earn more than $100K a year in salary, how does the company profit from you? It quickly spiraled out of control, the reply thread buzzing with answers that took on a life of their own until one particular response caught my eye, an unassuming comment by a user named Dismal Career. They recounted a story that chilled me to my core, describing their life working for a mysterious tech company that had risen to meteoric fame virtually overnight. Dismal Career painted a picture of a sleek office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a luxury cafe stocked with gourmet food, and endless perks that came with the hefty paycheck. But slowly, the reassurance of lavishness twisted into something darker, hints of an unsettling atmosphere creeping into their tales about the clandestine meetings and dairy corporate culture that seemed to revolve around some unspoken ethos of secrecy and performance. Dismal Career told of a peculiar practice known as Project Harvest, an initiative shrouded in ambiguity, where employees were encouraged to volunteer their personal data and to share insights about themselves in exchange for insights into their career growth. At first, it seemed harmless. People enjoyed the extravagant parties and company retreats, but whispers of employees vanishing swirled around the break room like a malevolent fog. Dismal Career felt uneasy, recalling how a friend of theirs, an excitable programmer, had gotten too close to discovering what Project Harvest truly involved and was never seen again. As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Dismal Career found themselves sinking deeper into the company's clutches, becoming embroiled in this twisted game. The company thrived profoundly from their volunteering, manipulating statistics and using personal data to develop a product that captivated the masses but dehumanized the workforce. Employees soon became nameless assets, their worth determined by how much data they could provide, not only in performance but in vulnerabilities and personal insights. As time wore on, Dismal Career noticed a troubling change within themselves. The ambition that once drove them began to warp into something grotesque, a hunger for success that crippled their very sense of morality. They started to view coworkers as merely tools, instruments to be played on the corporate stage, their worth tethered to a haunting algorithm that measured every pulse of their effort. The final straw came during a quarterly meeting marked by cold facades yet low whispers that echoed concerns of efficiency maximization. Rumor had it that employees who didn't reach the company's quota for data sharing would be off-boarded, the euphemism becoming a ghost story that loomed like a haunted specter over the office. Dismal Career's paranoia escalated as they learned their friend had indeed been discarded, subjected to archive, a terrifying mechanism through which those deemed surplus to the needs of the conglomerate were forgotten entirely. As dread settled in like a thick mist, Dismal Career decided to investigate further, setting up a clandestine meeting with others who shared their fears. In hushed tones, they banded together, developing a plan to expose Project Harvest, but they could never have anticipated the forces they were up against. The company had ears everywhere, and instinctively, one of their own, someone who had seemed genuinely concerned, betrayed them, tipping management off to their rebellion. One by one, after work hours, they began to vanish without a trace, lending terrifying credence to the stories of offboarding. And then it was Dismal Career's turn. On a mundane Tuesday evening, they received an ominous email requesting a final review with their supervisor. As they stepped into the conference room, a chill swept through them as the door clicked shut. The air grew heavy, pregnant with the knowledge of betrayal that rattled against the walls like an invisible force. They were cornered by their superiors, faces devoid of morality but brimming with suffocating authority. The details of Dismal Career's so-called reflection were painfully orchestrated, a judicial review turned ritualistic, and with every question, every assertion that their personal revelations had not been productive enough, the realization crashed into them like icy water. This was the archive in real time, the very system crafted to eradicate the unworthy. There was no way out, no escape from the clutches of a corporate monster, the price of which had come to fruition with their own consent. As the room dimmed, a blaring red light overshadowed them from a device surreptitiously hidden beneath the conference table. A final shred of disbelief filled their mind, elbowing past the uncomfortable truth. They were not just a cog in a machine, they had willingly contributed to creating an elaborate web of control that now entrapped them. Paralyzed by dread, they learned the bitter truth: the company didn't just profit from their presence, they fed off their very essence, a twisted loop of ambition and desperation that would deteriorate their humanity, all measured in algorithms. The last thing Dismal Career remembered before darkness swallowed them whole was the chilling reminder echoing in their mind from that Ask Reddit post: "Be careful what you share, you might just become what you give away." It started innocently enough, as most terrifying stories do, with a simple text from my younger sister, Alyssa. "Can you help with the decorations for my baby shower?" she'd asked, attaching an impossibly long Pinterest board filled with pastel balloons and intricate floral arrangements. I was buried in work, but she was my baby sister, the one I'd saved from Mom's wrath countless times when we were kids, so I agreed. Little did I know, this decision would unravel into a tangled mess that would leave me questioning my sanity. As the weeks slipped by, the requests grew more extravagant. Soon, I was in charge of not just decorations but catering, guest lists, and venues. Alyssa insisted on a specific lavender-themed color palette, because it's calming, she claimed, but it was odd how insistent she was. Each time I hit a minor snag, like the salmon bruschetta running out of stock or the lavender napkins on backorder, she'd chuckle on the phone in that lilting voice she used, almost like she already knew I'd have these problems. It was frustrating, especially when she'd call late at night, her voice tinged with desperation and a strange eeriness, saying, "Please, Sarah. This has to be perfect. It's important." Weeks crept forward, and the demands became increasingly peculiar. She wanted a specific brand of crème brûlée flown in from Paris, a harpist who'd play certain keys only during sunset, and, unreasonably, that every attendee wear a lavender-hued outfit. It was as if this shower was the pinnacle of her existence instead of a joyful gathering to celebrate new life. Then came the phone calls. They'd start with Alyssa's tremulous voice, but slowly diminished into jumbled whispers, almost like multiple voices talking over each other, all insisting on how the event had to meet a specific, almost ceremonial standard. Each time, I'd hear what I thought was another voice underneath hers, deeper, ominous, telling me in an undisputable tone to deliver. It was as if the baby shower had morphed into some sacred rite, with rules and rituals I dared not break. Days before the party, my exhaustion turned into paranoia. I'd hear rustling and whispers whenever I scrolled through that damned Pinterest board Alyssa was obsessed with, as if those pastel decorations and floral arrangements were trying to convey some cryptic message I couldn't fathom. An unsettling déjà vu tickled the back of my mind whenever I'd see those lavenders, familiar, yet impossibly out of context. It all climaxed a night before the shower. I was setting up at the venue, a remote, plush garden Alyssa had picked for its atmosphere, when an icy wind grazed my skin, and I froze. As I turned to grab the last strand of garland, I saw them. People, not relatives or Alyssa's friends, but figures dressed in anachronistic clothing, peering from behind the bushes, eyes glazed in anticipation like porcelain dolls waiting for the curtain's ascension. Their clothes, all lavender shades, dulled by age or maybe something else, almost like they were. No. I shut my eyes hard, attributing this to stress hallucinations. But it wasn't just that, I felt it in my gut, a lurch like a predator caught scent of me. I returned home, shaking off the cold embrace of that cursed venue, still trying to rationalize everything. That's when Alyssa's final call came in, jagged and warped across the static phone line as she plotted the shower's timeline once more. Her voice, now edged with something terrifyingly unfamiliar, intoned, "It can't go wrong, Sarah. You know what happens if it does." And then, in that moment laced with clarity or insanity, I whispered back, "I don't want anything to do with it," knowing whatever Alyssa had planned crossed beyond the line of mere mortal celebrations. The line went dead, though my soul quaked with a foreboding that the conversation was far from over. I did not attend the shower. I did not pick up her voicemails or listen to the eerily calm recordings she left, draped in the soft cries of infants, or something trying to mimic them, faint but insistently there. And as if on cue, Alyssa ceased contact. It was only months later, when the whispers at family gatherings turned to hushed tones, that I heard how the guests at the gathering, those anachronistic figures, merged into rumor, blurred like ghosts that twisted into the fabric of some forbidden tale no one wanted to admit they saw. They spoke of how those figures somehow vanished as the clouds swallowed the sun, leaving a lingering impression of purplish haze that seasoned the stories of everyone present. Some claimed the hues never left their wardrobes, some murmured of haunting lullabies, and one auntie fainted at our next holiday dinner when a lavender-clad infant crawled into her lap, though Alyssa claimed it was her baby, just innocent, just normal. But when Alyssa's eyes met mine across the room, there was no warmth left, Just the cold satisfaction that she'd completed a pattern older than we'd dare understand. I kept my mouth shut, more out of survival than cowardice, because when I hear the wind rustling through the leaves, I swear sometimes it carries an echo of her laugh, slow and triumphant, a dark melody trapped in the chilling lavender lull of a nightmare forgotten deliberately. I've always trusted my inner voice, you know, that instinct that tells you when something's not right or nudges you to take a different route home. It's a low hum deep inside me, a whisper that usually leads me away from danger, but a few weeks ago, it became something darker, a siren song that eventually led to someone's death. It started a month ago when I was walking through the local park. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden hue over the playground, where kids laughed, and parents chatted comfortably. But as I strolled along the familiar path, my inner voice suddenly erupted with fury, insisting I leave immediately. Confused, I hesitated, glancing around as if something sinister was lurking in the trees. After a moment, I shook off the feeling and continued walking, dismissing it as mere anxiety. Just as I rounded the corner, I spotted a man, a stranger in a dark hoodie sitting on a bench, staring intently at a little girl playing nearby. My stomach dropped as that same voice screamed at me to intervene, to somehow protect her. But I hesitated again, torn between confrontation and following some vague notion of prudence. Before I could make sense of my spiraling thoughts, I saw him get up and approach the girl. I've never felt fear like the moment that followed. Every muscle in my body froze as my gut twisted violently at his intent. Instinctively, I sprinted toward them, shouting for him to back off. As if in a trance, the man turned to face me, his expression unreadable. The girl's mother glanced over, horror painting her features as she dashed towards her daughter. My heart raced as I closed the distance, ready to put myself between them. But I'll never forget the look on the man's face. It wasn't anger or fear, it was something much colder, calculating. When the mother reached her child, the man simply smiled and walked away, leaving me panting and confused. Days passed, and I tried to shake the incident from my mind, but during sleepless nights, the voice returned, more insistent than ever. It started as quiet whispers, prompting me to drive down different streets, to avoid certain places, and to skip lunch with friends. I thought of it as a gift, an enhancement of my instincts, until I found myself standing outside my own apartment one evening, agitated and restless, when that voice turned malignant. It urged me to follow a figure shrouded in darkness, a ghost that beckoned me from the sidewalk, and against all reason, I took the bait. The figure led me deeper into alleys, twisting and turning until I found myself in a dimly lit part of town, where the air hung heavy with tension. I should have stopped, should have turned back, but the voice roared now, insisting I must know why I was brought here, why I needed to follow. Finally, it led me to the back of an old bar where two men argued. I couldn't make out the words, but something primal rumbled within me, forcing me to eavesdrop. The voice urged me closer, closer, and I was a puppet on strings, trapped in a narrative I did not control. Suddenly, one of the men pulled out a knife. My heart thundered, but the voice screamed for me to stay put, to watch, to learn. I shivered as I heard a harsh sound, a blade slicing through flesh. The man crumpled to the ground, dark red pooling around him, soaking the cracked asphalt. I wanted to scream, but the voice shackled me, forcing me to witness every horrifying second. It wasn't until the sirens blared, cutting through the stillness, that the figure evaporated into the shadows, leaving me standing, paralyzed by an invisible grip. Sharp focus returned as I stumbled back onto the street, realizing I had a front row seat to a murder, sealed within me like a dark secret. I hurried home, adrenaline coursing through my veins, my thoughts a whirlpool of regret and dread. Hours turned into restless nights filled with nightmares painted in blood, and I thought I'd never be the same. But worst of all was the nagging sense that somehow, I had been complicit. The voice was still there, taunting me to acknowledge the truth. Days bled into weeks, and I refused to confront the reality of my choices, yet I found myself drawn back to the park, as if it was magnetic. The warmth of the sun felt like a false promise, and I wandered among the trees, hoping to feel normal again. But my inner voice was restless, whispering that something else was lurking, waiting for me to acknowledge it. That's when I realized, the voice was no longer a guide, it was a predator, hunting for new prey. The vibrant park deteriorated into a cacophony of malevolence, and instincts morphed into a twisted game of survival where I was always the hunted. I needed to escape, to silence it once and for all, but every avenue led me back, ensnared in a cycle I couldn't comprehend. When the whispers led me to follow yet another shadow one night, I barely recognized myself. I was no longer the person listening to her instincts, I was lost in this abyss, deluding myself that if I witnessed or intervened, Perhaps I could absolve my guilt. But every choice turned darker, edging me closer to the ledge of madness as I started to feel the tug of something far more sinister. Each echoing footstep behind me or a rustling in the foliage twisted my stomach into knots, until one fateful evening, it finally culminated. I had followed the haunting voice back to where it all began, the park, but it wasn't by accident. It felt orchestrated, like a cruel joke. As the setting sun cast elongated shadows, my heart pounded in my chest as I found the same bench where I first saw that man. The dreadful sense of déjà vu washed over me when the figure reappeared, a shadow wearing a devilish grin, its eyes glimmering with a darkness that made every hair stand on end. The voice roared with triumph, pushing me forward as if wanting to embrace this abyss. That's when the unthinkable happened. The figure turned, revealing the scarred face of the man who had been murdered, and before I could process it, the voice transformed from an ally to a monster, hollering, "It's your fault." My stomach lurched as I realized my inner voice had been a gateway to the supernatural. It had led me to him, and in that terrible moment, I understood. My instincts had not only risked my life but also unwittingly led to the death of another person. It felt like drowning as the specter's hollow eyes bore into mine, reliving the pain and anguish, leaving no doubt that I'd become the puppet in a narrative spun from the threads of someone else's demise. I wanted to flee, but I was paralyzed, held captive by an awareness that maybe I had always been meant to follow, that every misstep had led me here. As his mouth opened to scream accusations, I screamed too, releasing every ounce of tangled horror that wrapped around my heart, and with it, I felt the suffocating grip of my inner voice pull away. That night, trapped in that park, I realized what had haunted me was never about trusting my instincts. It was about confronting the darkness I had allowed to fester, the blood on my hands that would never wash away. I never thought I'd find myself typing this out to a bunch of strangers on the internet, but here I am, shaking and unable to sleep. It was just an ordinary morning. The sun was creeping over the horizon, casting its first golden tendrils onto an unsuspecting world. I had been running late for work after my alarm decided to betray me, and I was in a rush, perhaps too much of a rush. You see, the road that stretches from my house to the office is a winding path through some dense woods, and despite its tranquil appearance, it transforms into a dark, shadowy gauntlet at dawn. There's this sharp turn just before you reach the bridge. Visibility there is close to zero when the morning fog rolls in, making it a spot that haunts the local news with accident reports every so often. You'd think I'd be more careful, having lived in this town my whole life, but I didn't see him. The jogger, that poor man, appeared out of nowhere, a fleeting specter from the mist. My heart is pounding just reliving it, the screech of the tires, the sickening thud, like the world collapsing into a single, terrifying moment. I pulled over, my hands trembling on the wheel. Panic surged through me, 1,000 what-ifs bombarding my mind. I stumbled out of the car, legs wobbly like jelly, and my heart pounding like a war drum. There he was, lying on the side of the road, motionless with the early light dancing over him like a cruel spotlight. I knelt beside him, my breath coming in ragged gasps, checking for any signs of life. He was breathing, barely. I wanted to call for help, every rational thought in my mind screamed at me to do so. But there was another voice, a quieter, sinister whisper, reminding me of the consequences. I glanced back at my car, the front bumper crumpled like an old tin can, and I felt a paralyzing wave of dread. In a flash, I imagined my life unraveling, my job, my freedom, my entire future hanging by a thread. I know how admissions of guilt work here, where the law and consequences feel more like the swing of a guillotine than the blindfolded Lady Justice. I couldn't afford it, literally and figuratively. And just like that, I was backing away, my survival instincts overwhelming any moral compass I had. I got in the car, every fiber of my being fighting my decision as I slammed the door shut and drove away, leaving him behind, alone and injured. I told myself I'd go to the police later once I sorted out my thoughts, but here I am, still undecided, my conscience screaming at me. The rest of my day blurred by like a bad dream, each sound amplified, the clacking of office keyboards, phones ringing, my boss's droning voice, all forming a cacophonic symphony that was slowly driving me insane. Not a soul seemed to notice my distress or the blood that I felt stained my every move. And then, as if by some cosmic jest, there was a newsflash, a hit and run on that very road, the jogger in critical condition with the police seeking any information. Guilt pierced through me, sharp and unrelenting, leaving me suffocating under its weight. Every face suddenly seemed to bear silent judgment, every eye a prying intruder into my burgeoning turmoil. My friends wondered why I was more quiet than usual, why I flinched at every shadow. And then the calls started. At first, It was just breathing, a soft, eerie rhythm echoing over the line whenever I answered, leaving me chilled to the bone. But then came a voice, distorted and hollow, whispering my name. I saw what you did. Each call lasted mere seconds but felt like an eternity, my sanity slipping with each new message. Was it him? Had he somehow found me, his spirit lingering in my wake, seeking justice? Or was it guilt manifesting in my mind, wreaking havoc on my every thought? I unplugged the phone, hoping to cling to some last shred of peace. Yet, as I write this, my heart skips a beat at every creak and groan of the house, feeling eyes upon me in the shadows, waiting. I can't tell anyone. How could I bring myself to confess to such horror? I feel trapped in this spiral, caught between fear, regret, and a desperate need for redemption. The weight has become unbearable. I see him in my dreams now, standing on the edge of the fog, waiting, always watching. The dread has me tired and old more than I have ever been. What can I do when every path leads to my own ruin? I wish I could turn back the clock. If only I'd stopped to help, called for an ambulance, did something other than give in to panic. Maybe then I wouldn't be here, eyes wide open, fearing the inevitable knock on my door. It's only a matter of time before my crumbling resolve is torn apart by a reality of my own creation. How does one live with such a damning secret, a confession I wish I could share with more than just faceless companions on the internet? Maybe they know when your own words betray you, unraveling across a screen. So here I sit, hoping to find some solace or guidance, dreading both the implications of silence and the words now permanently etched into my digital confession. When I first heard my sister-in-law's decision to name her newborn son something that could easily confuse even the most seasoned linguist, I remember the way my heart sank, not out of disdain but out of concern. The name was an intricate blend of characters from her family's native language, twisted into an assortment of letters that held no meaning here in America. And so, during our usual family gathering, as my nephew's 10-month-old chuckles echoed across the living room between the birthday balloons and leftover frosting, I took a breath, weighed the potential fallout, and asked her if she'd considered letting him use a more straightforward American name. It was a simple suggestion, one born from a place of love and long-term foresight. I imagined the endless frustrations my nephew would face as he grew, a child with a name so difficult that classmates would laugh, teachers would mispronounce it, and forms would never be filled out correctly. My sister-in-law's face shifted from surprise to pure indignation. She fired back, claiming that a name holds a history and a culture, and who was I to strip him of that? I didn't argue. I merely pointed out that this wasn't about erasing his heritage, it was about gifting him the opportunity to float through life without the relentless burden of spelling out his name every time he met someone new, without having to watch the confusion wash over people's faces as they stumbled over syllables. But she was having none of it, the tension spiraled, and in a sudden burst, I found myself labeled the asshole when the family took her side, supporting her deep-rooted ties blinking brightly against my softer, practical vision. She emphasized that this wasn't simply a name. It was a bridge between generations, a cherished piece of her ancestry, unyielding to modern whims. For a few days, I sat with a heavy heart, the echoes of our argument replaying in vivid detail, how sometimes in cultures, love manifests through reverence of tradition, how family dynamics twist and weave into something fragile yet beautiful, and how easily I had risked shattering it with my careless words. By the end of the week, however, I thought maybe it was time to talk again, to mend what had frayed. I envisioned a well-structured apology, the kind that might encapsulate understanding and a mutual desire to meet halfway, reminding her of how much I adored that little boy. When I called, ready to reconnect, my sister-in-law answered, her voice halting, muted. She told me about her evening, a terrifying experience where she and my brother had ventured to a neighborhood they were unfamiliar with. It had been dusk, the sun settling into an underbelly of deep purple when their car broke down, stranded in an eerie silence with shadows stretching like sinister fingers. They decided to walk to the nearest store, an act of desperation, but as they turned the corner, she recalled the frigid chill that settled on her skin. That's when she noticed them, a group of men gathered under a flickering streetlight, their laughter cutting through the twilight like glass. My heart raced as she described how they eyed her and her husband with unsettling interest, their gazes lingering on her brother's jeweled hoodie and her tone of voice thick with fear as they approached. She recounted every detail, their jeering comments, the way they slurred their sentences, the tension palpable as they surrounded them. In that moment, I realized her sacred tether to tradition felt like an echoing cry for protection, that by naming her son something they could pronounce, she believed it could shield him from prejudice, give him an airbrushed identity that would deflect harsh scrutiny and cruel ridicule. But then, something unexpected happened. She whispered a name, the name she and my brother had contemplated in secret, An American twist to his name, a compromise that would soothe her heart and strengthen my brother's resolve. Suddenly, ancient familial ties took on a modern hue, blending cultures instead of being at war with them. What should have created a rift spun into a connection, a reassurance that in this tumultuous world, names hold more than just meaning, they carry the weight of values, hopes, and fears. It brought us to a moment where we could choose to empathize rather than just stand at the battleground of opinions. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as I realized the powerful truth behind her words, that the name they ultimately picked would be a testament to resilience, strength, and the melding of two worlds, a reminder that we're not just rooting for our identities individually but forging new paths that intertwine, that carry echoes of our past while still reaching for a future where my nephew could be whoever he wanted to be without the complex burden of divided heritage. In that sudden clarity, I became aware of how fragile these conversations are, how easily misunderstanding can gnaw at the edges of relationships, fracturing the love that defines them. So, no, I do not wish to be the asshole, but rather a bridge, a listener, someone who opens doors to discourse rather than shuts them to judgment. Names can matter, oh they do matter, but so does family, especially when the world feels intent on tearing us apart. I never thought a simple date would spiral into a nightmare, but here I am, recounting the events that haunt me as I sit in my dimly lit apartment, staring into the flickering candlelight, words barely making sense, drowning in the echoes of that night. It started out like any other Saturday. I was nervous but excited to meet Jenna, a girl I had been texting for weeks. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party, laughter enveloping us as music thumped in the background, and people danced like carefree souls oblivious to the world. The energy was electric, and I hoped this was the start of something special. Jenna, with her luminous smile and sparkling eyes, seemed to brighten the room. But as the night wore on, that light began to flicker. After a round of drinks, I felt parched and decided to ask Jenna to fetch us some water, an innocuous request that should have been simple. Instead, she looked at me like I had asked her to perform a magic trick. "Seriously? You can just get it yourself," she said, her tone sharp, cutting through the gaiety of the party like a knife. I was taken aback. It was hardly an unreasonable request after the drinks we had consumed. Stunned, I brushed off the moment, believing it to be a miscommunication, yet her dismissive attitude gnawed at me. Minutes passed, and I tried to engage in the small talk around, but it all felt hollow. Jenna continued to chat with her friends, occasionally shooting me glances that seemed to say, "Why are you still here?" It hit me then how uncomfortable I felt. This was not the warm and welcome atmosphere I had anticipated. So, I took a deep breath and attempted to lighten the mood. "Hey, I'm going to grab some water, do you want anything?" I asked her, trying to keep it lighthearted, still holding on to the hope we could turn this evening around. By now, I could feel the tension cracking open around us as if we were both trying to spin our own webs in a place that was already tangled in others. "You can literally just walk into the kitchen and pour some," she replied, her voice laced with irritation, as if I were asking her to climb Mount Everest barehanded. It was the tone that bruised me, not even the words. With every second that ticked by, my irritation swelled. The people around us were moving, laughing, blissfully unaware of our subtle battle of wills. My heart sank within my chest as I realized I was no longer interested in salvaging the evening. I stood up, ready to leave, hoping she would at least show a flicker of concern. Instead, she laughed, almost mockingly. "Wow, real mature," she snorted, turning back to the crowd. I felt invisible, and just like that, the decision was made. I would gather my things and exit this bemusing charade. In a twisted instance of irony, as I approached the door, I wondered if I was the asshole for leaving a party over something so trivial. Did I overreact? Was it my fault she wouldn't get me water? I hesitated at the threshold, a part of me yearning to turn around, but I stepped through the door, crossing the boundaries of friendship and awkwardness forever. Just as I began walking to my car, dark clouds loomed overhead, drawing shadows that felt personal, like nightmares coiling just outside my view, and I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. I quickened my pace, blaming the chill of the night air for the goosebumps prickling my skin, but instinct whispered at the nape of my neck to turn around. Looking back, I saw nothing but the dim glow of the house party behind me. It was ridiculous. I dismissed all the creeping thoughts and slid into my car, attempting to shake off the unsettling sensation that this was far from over. I took a deep breath, the car feeling like a cocoon of closure, but then my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Jenna appeared, her words striking back like a serpent. "You're seriously going to leave because I wouldn't get you water? Wow, guess you're not as cool as I thought." My jaw clenched. I started typing out a response, my fingers furious against the glass screen, but then I stopped. I didn't need to give her any more of my energy. I'd made my choice. Reeling from the night already, I left that house behind me, only to realize that the closer I got to home, the louder the world around me became. The street had grown eerily quiet, as though I crossed through a curtain between normalcy and obscurity. Just as I turned a corner, an intense chill sliced through the air. The street lights flickered, illuminating the asphalt in wild bursts, shadows dancing across my vision in unsettling ways. Was it paranoia or something lurking just outside my line of sight? I glanced at my rearview mirror. A figure loomed in the distance, tall, cloaked, and heading directly toward me. As the figure drew near, I saw its face, white and haunting, with dark holes for eyes that meticulously bore into my soul. My heart began to race, panic flooding my veins. I threw the key into the ignition, desperate to flee, but the engine sputtered. The figure's gait was deliberate, fixed on me as the shadow danced closer, and though I tried to convince myself I was merely overreacting from an embarrassing evening, my instincts screamed otherwise. I was prey, and it was the hunter closing in. My eyes darted back to the road, desperately swiping at my phone in search of a small sense of safety, but the screen faded to black, and then I noticed it. The figure was nearly upon me. I couldn't hold back the scream that clawed at my throat as I pounded at the wheel, raw terror seeping into every facet of my being. And just before I could get the car to sputter along, there was a loud, harsh knock on the window that sent me nearly leaping out of my seat. It was Jenna, eyes wide, face twisted in excitement that was somehow both terrifying and exhilarating, but then beneath her glee, I saw something else, a flicker of something darker. "We need to talk," she yelled, just before the darkness closed in around us, silencing the world outside like it was a figment in a dream, leaving her standing there with that haunting smile, and in that moment, I understood we hadn't merely left a party, we had crossed an unseeable line, and now it was time for the real horror to begin. I still recall the crunch of metal and the blinding light that consumed my vision when the car shattered around us that fateful day, my 7th birthday, robbed in an instant. My mother didn't survive, yet I walked away with nothing but a bruised body and an inexplicable voice that took up residence in my mind, whispering dark thoughts I'd later come to attribute to survivor's guilt. It often taunted me, reminding me that I had lived while she hadn't, sowing seeds of shame that nestled deep in my soul. This voice would chant her name like a prayer turned curse, luring me into momentary madness as I whispered back, seeking solace in the silence of my lonely bedroom. At first, I told no one. It was a secret that became both my companion and tormentor over the years. The voice would suggest things. "Why don't you tell your dad that you see her? Why not try to reach out?" I felt the tremors of its seductive pull, but fear tethered me to my reality. After all, who would believe a child who claimed to speak with the dead? I grew older, learned to shove it deep down where shadows lie, but occasionally, it would slip out, a soft murmur in a quiet classroom, a fleeting echo during a lazy stroll through the park, always hinting at things only I could hear, things only she could say. I couldn't shake it off, yet life moved forward, dragging me along like a dream I didn't want to wake up from until last week when I turned 20 and decided to visit the accident site. Curiosity mingled with dread. As I stood there, with the tree dressed in vibrant autumn colors, the air thick with the scent of fallen leaves, the voice returned, sharper, clearer than ever, drumming in sync with the pounding of my heart. "You shouldn't be here." I shivered at the warning, invigorated with both terror and defiance. I thought it was just remnants of my childhood nightmares. But then I heard it, a woman sobbing, an echo that bled through the quiet surrounding me, and my heart sank as I realized it wasn't just me. I turned to find her, my mother, her form shimmering in the distance, translucent yet heartbreakingly real. I couldn't breathe, the chaos of emotion gripped me, calling to her through the veil. "Mom, is that really you?" I stumbled forward, each step sinking me deeper into a dark affection for this ghostly reunion, but as I reached for her, she faded like morning mist. That's when the voice snarled with a furious intensity I had never heard before, "She's not here for you." My stomach twisted, as if a hand had coiled around my insides, and I felt the world shift, dread pouring over me like a monsoon as I sank to my knees. My voice trembled as I forced the question, "Why are you doing this?" Silence enveloped me, then a laughter clawed its way into the air, wicked and cruel, an echo of all the years I had hidden from my truth. My mother's spirit flickered back into view, her ghostly figure illuminating the twilight, but something was wrong. Her eyes were pleading, desperate. "Do you not see? You're not the survivor, you're the sacrifice." The words lashed through me like a whip, the voice now a shriek that clawed at my sanity, forcing me back into the past I thought I had left behind. Fear had settled into my bones as I backed away, shaking my head, but the voice wouldn't stop. "You were never supposed to live, not without her. She sacrificed you. And now, she's coming to collect." I bolted, adrenaline surging as I sprinted through the forest, branches clutching at my clothing, and I could hear her soft whimpering mingling with the madness in my head. "You can't escape your fate." I tore into the open road where the accident had been, cars blaring in confusion as I stumbled, gasping for air, my mind racing. I found myself in front of an old, crumbling church at the edge of town. I darted inside, hoping there might be solace among the walls steeped in hope and prayer, but the voice followed like a shadow. "This is where it all began, where she let you live." As the realization sunk in, sensation began to warp, the sanctuary morphing into a twisted hall of mirrors reflecting the darkness I carried within. Panic surged again as I screamed for someone to help me, only the echo of my terror replied, bouncing back like a relentless taunt. I knew I had to confront her. I threw myself into the center of the sanctuary, where sunlight pierced through with divine illumination, a stark contrast to the hell gnawing at me. "I want to be free," I shouted, letting all the fear and pain flow out, a cathartic release, but the voice only laughed, a sound that shattered the silence, bringing forth visions of my mother, lost and tormented, reaching out to me from the depths of despair. "This is where it ends," I insisted, feeling a surge of courage that I had thought extinguished like the burning candles around me. I fell to my knees, begging for clarity, feeling the warmth that drifted from the light. I urged her spirit to listen, to break free of the chains that bound her to this life. But the voice spoke louder, drowning my plea, wrapping around my throat like a noose. "She was never yours to save, and she never wanted you." With every syllable, reality crashed around me, and I could feel the ground waver under my weight. The church began to tremble as shadows danced, whirling like a cyclone, and as her wailing escalated, the truth came tumbling down like bricks. This was no voice of grief, it was a guardian of darker realms, a remnant of a soul that had moved on but lingered. No, I was never meant to survive, I was the remnant, a tether that held her here to suffer eternally with me. I shut my eyes against the onslaught of realization, heart pounding with the urgency to break this cycle. At that moment, I understood that it wasn't just my mother who was trapped, it was I who had held her captive all these years, a bond of love turned malignant. "I'm sorry, Mom," I cried, extending my hands out into the encroaching darkness, feeling layers of guilt peel away, begging the forces surrounding me to let go, to turn our painful bond into the unbreakable kindness of memories. "Please forgive me," I sobbed into the encroaching void, hoping for release. Everything stopped, memories flooded in, beautiful yet haunting, a montage of laughter and love stretching back to that summer day we baked cookies together. She pulled me close during thunderstorms, and all the little moments that could have lasted forever if we hadn't found ourselves in that car. And as the wave of understanding cascaded over my heart, I felt her releasing me, the air thick with loss but lighter than it had ever been. The weight of years grew faint, and as I opened my eyes once more, I found I was alone in the sanctuary, the last remnants of her presence dissolving into the golden sun. But I knew the voice wouldn't quiet, a truth clung to me like a tattoo on my spirit, that nightmarish voice, the last echo of a love that had twisted into a morbid whisper. I could never escape it, never forget what happened on that cursed day. But now, I carry her memory forward, imperfect yet marred with beauty, a reminder of sacrifice and love intertwined eternal, reminding me that sometimes the most prominent voices thou hear are reflections of the bonds we couldn't bear to sever. The night was unusually still when I heard the muffled noise coming from the den. At first, I thought it was our daughter, Alice, wandering around after having one of her frequent nightmares. But as I tiptoed down the carpeted hallway, I found my wife, Linda, bent over her laptop, the glow of the screen casting an eerie light on her face. Roblox. Again. This was not the first time I'd caught her entranced by the blocky landscapes of the game, but it had become more frequent, almost obsessive. As days turned into weeks, her immersive escape into this virtual world seemed to cost us dearly. The house was a mess, dishes piled up, laundry untouched, and, most concerningly, Alice was becoming more withdrawn. She needed her mother, both of us, in ways we seemed to overlook amidst our fragmented family routine. I confronted Linda gently at first, merely suggesting she ease off the game to help Alice with her homework or maybe join us for dinner rather than being surgically attached to her laptop. Instead of understanding, Linda looked up, her eyes narrowed, as if she'd been jerked away from a much happier realm. "It's not a game to me, John," she practically whispered, and there was a tremor in her voice, a discordant note that chilled my spine. She tried to explain that Roblox was more than a mere distraction, it was her sanctuary, A place where she felt she belonged, a community that appreciated her in ways reality never did. I wanted to understand, but every attempt to pull her back into the tangible world felt like trying to retrieve someone drowning who refused to be rescued. One drizzly Sunday, as I was folding laundry, I overheard Alice talking to someone in her room, her voice hushed and fearful. I crept to the door, my heart pounding, and paused just outside. "But you promised," she was saying, and in the silence that followed, I could barely hear an answer. It was Linda's voice, but with a flatness that all but erased her warmth. Something was terribly wrong. The tension in the house thickened like smoke, and I became hyper-aware of Linda's interactions with Alice, of her increasing absence from our lives. She spent more time in Roblox, often staying up till dawn, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness the next day. It wasn't until I found Alice sleeping by the door to the den one stormy night, her cheeks glistening with tears, that I insisted Linda face reality. "You need to stop playing and focus on Alice," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But Linda didn't even look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the screen, moving rhythmically with the game, a serene smile frozen on her lips like a mask. Desperate, I began to dig into the game itself, curious about what held such a vice grip on my wife. I discovered she was part of a group, an enclave of players who spoke in cryptic messages, referencing events and things I could not understand. But they seemed intent, a cult-like devotion embedded in their exchanges. My concern turned to dread as I unearthed stories of players who had vanished, rumored to have been absorbed into the game itself. Whispered tales circulated the forums about accounts going inactive after behavior like Linda's, after players claimed they'd found a better home within Oblivion, the name of the group's hub world. One evening, consumed by an increasing sense of urgency, I decided to confront Linda more forcefully. The night was buzzing with the sound of a distant thunderstorm when I slammed her laptop shut mid-game. My patience finally snapped. I demanded she explain herself, tell me what allure Roblox held that was more compelling than her own family. Her reaction was visceral, her smile fell, replaced by a hostility I'd never seen, her features contorted as she said, "You'll never understand, John. They've given me something you never could." The statement stung, but before our argument could escalate, the power blinked off, plunging us into darkness save for the dim glow of emergency lights and the monotonous drone of the storm outside. That night, Linda disappeared. I called out for her, searching room by room as a growing terror churned in my gut. Alice clung to me tightly, her tiny hands shaking as much as my own. I thought I'd find Linda in the den again. But there was only her laptop, abandoned and open to a blank screen, except as I reached for it, the screen flickered to life with a distorted image of a game world set at dusk, eerily mimicking our home. It was a scene that no other player should have seen, yet here it was, displayed in chilly, simulated clarity. What terrified me most was seeing Linda, or at least her avatar, waving goodbye from the digital front porch. I slammed the laptop shut again, unable to stomach the sight. The police were baffled as they combed through our home, chalking her disappearance up to a domestic dispute despite my insistence about the game. Days bled into weeks, yet every night around the witching hour, I'd hear the same gentle rumbles from the den, Linda's soft whisper lingering just out of reach, an indelible presence haunting our lives. Alice sometimes tells me she's spoken to her mom, that her avatar visits during her game's quiet nights, offering shadowy reassurances that sting more than soothe. My resolve to protect Alice has grown fervent, even as the digital mulberry skies of Roblox continue to hold their inscrutable allure. But some part of me fears that Linda, who loved us once, who is with us not merely in spirit but in flesh, has become nothing more than a ghost haunting the boundaries between worlds, a lost echo who may never return. It was 3 a.m. when I stumbled upon the thread titled "You're given a million of whatever you last googled." What is it? On AskReddit, a harmless way to distract me from my insomnia, something different from my usual dark rabbit holes, so I clicked in, only half paying attention to my own search history until I remembered that just hours before, I had been so terrified by an unexplained noise from the basement that I googled how to deal with ghosts. As I read through the responses from other users who'd joked about their musings, millions of puppies, a lifetime supply of pizza, or, hilariously, $1 million, I began to idly contemplate what it might mean to wake up the next morning with a million ghosts clamoring in my house. I laughed it off, justified it as tired whimsy, and climbed into bed, but as the night wore on, the shadows in the corners of my room shifted, twisting into something unsettling. I tossed and turned, losing sleep to both weariness and a growing dread, each creak of the old beams above me echoing like an ominous whisper, reminding me of the absurdity of my late-night Googling. Morning broke, and as sunlight splashed over everything, I shook off the peculiar feeling, convincing myself it was just fatigue, but as I moved about my day, I couldn't shake the gnawing conviction that something was different. My phone buzzed with notifications, and I found my friends online, laughing about the thread, sharing what would you get? But their humor faded as I glanced around my house. The air thickened, it felt alive, almost charged, but I ignored it, blaming my imagination. When evening fell, I finally buckled down to go through my notes for the lecture I had to give the following day, but even with my focus, I couldn't quiet the nagging feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't until I turned off the lights, surrendering to a restless sleep, that I heard it, a soft, melodic humming, so gentle at first but growing louder, curling into my dreams like smoke. It was beautiful yet unrecognizable, and when I awoke, it was deeper into the night than I thought possible, the shadows pressing against the walls like a living quilt, and I felt them before I saw them. A flicker in the corner of my eye revealed what I dared not believe, formless shapes drifting near the edges of my vision, spectral outlines gathering just out of reach, and the humming drifted into whispers, soft but urgent, a cacophony of voices that filled the air with their disembodied urgency. I leapt from my bed, flipping on every light, only to be met with an oppressive silence and the echoes of my own ragged breath. That was when I saw them, pale imprints of fragmented faces, their eyes dark voids that swallowed all light, appearing clearer each moment, pressing closer, a legion of souls stretching back into the darkened recesses of my small abode, all seeking something they had lost. Panic surged through my veins as I scrambled to comprehend, heart hammering as the cold, bitter reality settled upon me. You couldn't give away or return a million ghosts. I remembered the threat and the mocking comments. They weren't just jokes, they had become my rapture and my curse, my million specters lost and seeking, each lost to life in a way I couldn't fathom but somehow felt in my bones. They hovered at the edges of my sanity, flickering like shadows yearning for warmth, and now, they were mine, mixed up with every memory and nightmare I ever had. I tried to reason with them, to plead for their departure, but the whispers grew louder, growing agitated, swirling around me like a tempest. And then, as if stirred from slumber, the whispers coalesced into a single voice, tinged with sorrow, a ghostly wail that pierced through my mind, a tangled tapestry of emotions threading together, revealing flashes of their lives that had been snuffed out too soon. In that moment, I realized they weren't just haunting, they were trapped, bound to me by a wish they never saw, imploring me for release, an escape that I couldn't provide. I sank to the floor, desperate, tears streaming down my face as I finally understood this was my doing, not just a fun thread, but a reality warped beyond comprehension. The remnants of their stories tugged at my heartstrings, of lives lost to violence, despair, tragedies untold, and suddenly the weight of my existence bore down on me. I had turned their pain into a mere joke, something to chuckle at in the heat of a sleepless night, and now their despair filled my home, each face a reminder of warnings ignored and pleas unheard. It felt surreal, those moments in dark clarity where the divide between the living and the dead blurred into a haunting truth. Seeking absolution, they gathered, and I realized I was drowning in a sea of regrets long buried. I had wanted answers to the supernatural, a fright not faced, and now I bore the broken shards of their existence in my waking world. I smashed the mirror in a panic, desperately searching through the shards for clarity, for a way to break the curse I had unwittingly unleashed, when a hollow voice echoed, promising release, "Help us, and we will help you." I should have recoiled, should have turned and fled, but the desperation pulled me in like a moth to flame, swallowing me whole, binding me to these spirits who had lost everything. They threaded the darkness through my heart, offering me power in exchange for their freedom, an exchange laced with a sinister beauty I could barely process, leaving only one question: how far am I willing to go to erase the mistake I made on that innocent evening? I don't have the answer yet, but I'll let you know if I ever return, haunted and hollow, that maybe what we search for online brings up more than we bargained for, and perhaps, just perhaps, my million ghosts were only the beginning.